Hi, everybody. Tonight, let us drift slowly back in time to the soot-choked alleyways and cobbled streets of Victorian London, a place where life was often as cold and damp as the mist that curled around gaslit corners. This story will unfold, piece by piece, like the slow creak of a wooden door on an ancient hinge, revealing why life, for so many, was brutal in this era of grand facades and hidden miseries. Settle beneath your blankets, rest your head, and listen as we begin our long walk through the shadowed lanes of the past. In the year 1842, a boy named Thomas stood barefoot on the edge of Drury Lane, the chill of dawn slipping like a ghost through the tattered seams of his jacket. He was 12 years old, though the grime that mapped his cheeks and the hollows beneath his eyes made him appear older. Older in sorrow, older in hunger. Around him, London was waking, but it was never truly asleep. There were always whispers behind brick walls, always feet shifting along the muddy streets, always the hiss of steam from some hidden pipe. Thomas sniffed the air for a promise of bread. None came. His mother, Ellen, had died the winter before, claimed by the same fever that haunted the tenements of the poor like a phantom. His father, John, was somewhere near the docks, or so Thomas hoped. Men drifted like flotsam between ships and taverns, their work as uncertain as the tides of the Thames. And so Thomas had become one of London's countless street hawkers, his voice cracking like frost as he called out the wares he did not have. Today, he carried only a bundle of matches and a pocketful of hope that someone, somewhere, would spare a farthing. He moved past Covent Garden, its market stalls just beginning to bloom with crates of bruised fruit and stiff, wilted flowers. The flower girls, only slightly older than Thomas, stood wrapped in shawls that smelled of mildew. They sang songs under their breath, melodies that wove through the cold like fragile threads of warmth. He knew some of them by name: Lizzie, who never smiled; Mary, whose hands were always red and raw from scrubbing floors when flowers could not be sold. As the sun lifted, pale and watery, Thomas heard the heavy clatter of a carriage. He stepped back against a wall just in time as the wheels splashed through a puddle of filth, drenching his bare toes. Inside the carriage, a gentleman sat beneath a tall hat, his gloved hand resting on the window as if to keep the world at bay. Thomas caught only a glimpse, a fine coat, the shimmer of a gold watch chain, but it was enough to remind him that two Londons existed side by side. One of velvet drapes and warm hearths, of dinner parties and parlors heavy with perfume, and the other, his London, of soot, soup lines, and shadows. He drifted toward the docks by afternoon, drawn by the faint promise of work. Sometimes, if the foreman was desperate, a boy could earn a shilling carrying crates or sweeping sawdust from the warehouse floors. The river smelled of salt and sewage, its surface broken by the hulks of ships groaning beneath cargo that would never belong to boys like Thomas. He watched the men unload barrels of tea and sugar, their backs bent, their breath puffing clouds into the cold. He wondered how many coins passed from hand to hand before a crumb of that sugar touched a mouth like his. Near the warehouses, he found old Bram. Nobody knew his real name. Bram sat on an upturned crate, his coat patched with pieces of old sails and potato sacks. He sold scraps of gossip, and once in a while, for a penny, he would tell a boy where to find the best chance of work. Thomas approached with careful steps. "Got a penny, lad?" Bram rasped, his voice like coal dust in the wind. "Not today," Thomas said, his voice trembling in the morning air. "But if you tell me where they need boys, I'll bring you 2 tomorrow." Bram squinted, scratching at a nest of beard. "Aye, you're a good one. Try the fish market. Dockmaster said he'd lost 3 boys to the fever last week. Might be a place for you there." Thomas thanked him, clutching his matches tighter in his palm. The fish market was a stinking maze of barrels and ice, but if they needed boys to gut herring and haul baskets, he could stand the smell. Anything was better than going home empty-handed to the echo of his mother's silence. He trudged on, weaving past drunks slumped against tavern walls and the occasional swell of laughter spilling from a door left ajar. He saw the beggars with their empty bowls and blind eyes turned skyward, their rags moving like small gray flags in the breeze. He saw the chimney sweeps, smaller than himself, their faces black as soot demons, their arms thin as willow switches. He wondered if he would have done better to crawl up chimneys, but he'd heard the stories, boys stuck in flues, their cries muffled by brick and mortar. No, the streets were cruel, but at least they offered escape. By dusk, Thomas found himself sitting on a set of stone steps behind a church, his feet numb, his belly tight with hunger that never seemed to ease. He struck one of his matches, watching the tiny flame dance before the wind snuffed it out. He imagined his mother's voice in the flicker, soft, telling him tales of fields far beyond the city, where the air was clean and the earth smelled of green things instead of smoke. He pressed his back against the stone and pulled his knees to his chest. In the distance, Big Ben told the hour, each chime rolling through the streets like a slow heartbeat. Somewhere, far away, rich men and women dined by candlelight. They raised glasses. They spoke of the empire and progress and profit. They did not see Thomas. They did not hear him whisper into the darkness, promising himself that tomorrow he would find work, tomorrow he would eat, tomorrow he would live. And so, beneath the vast canopy of London's blackened sky, the boy drifted into a restless sleep, one match left unstruck in his pocket, like a fragile wish waiting for a kinder dawn. When Thomas woke, the stone steps were slick with dew, and the city had begun its mournful hum once more. He rubbed his eyes with the back of his wrist, feeling grit and cold pressed into his skin. A thin fog drifted down from the river, curling through the alleys and lanes like a prowling beast. He stood, joints stiff from the chill, and shook the dust from his threadbare coat. The single match he had guarded through the night was still in his pocket, though it would do little to keep him warm now. He set his feet toward Billingsgate, London's great fish market, where the scent of brine and blood stained the air long before the stalls came into sight. As he neared, the clamor rose, barrow boys shouting prices, porters barking orders, gulls crying above in frantic circles. Thomas pressed closer, weaving through carts piled high with crates of cod and baskets of slippery eels. Men in heavy aprons gutted fish on wooden blocks, slick with scales and guts. The sight turned his stomach, but hunger did worse. He found the dockmaster, a squat man with a bristled beard and an eye that never quite looked at you straight. He stood by a stack of barrels, counting coins with stubby fingers that smelled of salt. "Please, sir," Thomas said, voice small beneath the market's roar. "You needing any boys today?" The dockmaster's eye flicked his way. He spat a dark stream of tobacco to the stones. "You any good with a knife, lad?" Thomas nodded, though he had never held a gutting blade. He would have said yes to anything. The dockmaster narrowed his gaze, then jerked his thumb toward a low shed behind the main stalls. "See Big Martha? She'll set you to work if she thinks you're worth the stink." Thomas ducked past the barrels and found the shed, a dim, wet cavern of a place where the floor was ankle-deep with meltwater and fish heads bobbed like pale masks. Big Martha stood by a long table, her arms bare to the elbow, sleeves rolled to reveal thick wrists and hands quick with the blade. She carved through a cod's belly with the ease of a seamstress splitting cloth. She glanced at Thomas, her mouth twisted in a line that might have been a smile or a warning. "Got hands?" she asked. He held them out. Small, knuckles bruised purple from the cold. "Ever gutted?" He hesitated only a moment before nodding. "Good," she grunted. She slapped a small blade into his palm, dull at the tip, but sharp enough along the belly. "Don't slip and gut yourself, or I'll toss you to the gulls. Work till the cart's empty, then we'll see if you've earned your crust." Thomas set to it beside her, mimicking her motions. The fish were cold and slick, their scales like silver coins under the flickering lanterns. The smell made his eyes water, the cold brine numbing his raw fingers. He cut clumsily at first, hacking more than slicing, but Martha did not shout. She simply worked around him, her knife flashing like a tiny, merciless scythe. Hours passed. He could tell only by the change in the light that seeped through cracks in the shed wall. His back ached, and each nick of the blade sent a hot spark of pain up his arm. Still, he did not stop. He dared not. The other boys in the shed, two older lads with sunken cheeks, watched him from under their brows, their faces masked by fish blood and the hard knowledge that a weak link could mean fewer coins for them all. At last, the cart was empty. Martha wiped her knife on her apron and looked Thomas over. "Not the worst I've seen," she said. She fished in her pocket and pressed 2 copper pennies into his palm. They were warm from her skin, and for a moment they felt like gold. Be here again tomorrow at dawn. Don't be late, or I'll give your place to another." Thomas nodded, relief swelling in his chest. He stepped back into the daylight, blinking against the gray. His fingers were raw. The smell of fish clung to him like a curse. But he clutched those pennies so tight they left little dents in his palm. 2 pennies meant bread, maybe even a crust with a smear of dripping. He thought of Bram, waiting near the docks. He would pay the old man his penny, keep his word, and perhaps find more work come next tide. He drifted away from the market, slipping past wagons and the restless swirl of gulls. His stomach cramped with hunger. Outside a bakehouse, he pressed his nose to the warm, yeasty air drifting from the ovens. Inside, rows of loaves stood stacked behind a dusty window, each one a small fortress of hope. He pushed through the door, the sudden heat washing over him like summer. A stout woman eyed him from behind the counter. "What's your coin worth, then?" Thomas laid down 1 penny, careful to keep the other safe for Bram. The woman weighed it in her palm, then dropped a small, hard roll into a scrap of paper. He stepped outside again, the bread clutched tight, afraid someone might snatch it before he could taste it. He found a quiet corner by a crumbling wall, crouched low, and bit in. The crust cut his gums, but the dry chew was sweeter than any sugar. He ate it all, every crumb, licking the paper for the taste of flour. The sky darkened early, as it often did when the Thames belched its mist through the lanes. Thomas wiped his hands on his coat. The hunger eased, but not gone. It never was. He thought of his mother, her voice softer than Martha's, her hands gentle and smelling of lavender when such things could be afforded. He wondered if she would be proud of him now, gutting fish, earning pennies that clinked like tiny promises in his pocket. As night crept in, he found Bram perched by a stack of empty crates, mumbling to himself. Thomas placed the remaining penny into the old man's palm. "Kept my word," he said. Bram's eyes flicked open, pale and cloudy. He closed his fingers over the coin. "A good lad," he rasped. "A good lad don't stay good long in this city. Mind yourself, Tommy boy." Thomas nodded, though the warning was lost in the rumble of passing carts and the whisper of fog curling in from the docks. He turned his face to the streetlights, winking alive, one by one, their glow barely cutting the gathering dark. Somewhere out there, another dawn waited. Another day of knives and cold water, and the slow promise that if he just kept moving, just kept cutting, the city might not swallow him whole. So he walked, the city's breath rising in soft clouds around him, and he dreamed, for a little while, of a place where the air did not smell of fish and coal, and a boy could sleep without waking to stone and frost. The next morning, Thomas rose before the city's heartbeat had quickened, the streets still hushed beneath a thin veil of dawn mist. His back was stiff from where he had curled against a church wall through the night, the stone pressing a cold memory into his bones. He flexed his fingers, feeling the sting of yesterday's cuts still raw along his knuckles. The smell of fish clung stubbornly to his sleeves, even after the rain had tried to wash it away in the night. He set off toward Billingsgate once more, his feet splashing through shallow puddles where the gaslight flickered and reflected like broken stars. As he walked, he passed other shapes moving through the gray. Milkmaids with heavy pails swinging from calloused hands, rag pickers dragging sacks along the gutter, chimney sweeps already blackened with soot though the sun had yet to rise. London's hidden army, waking before the fine folk had even drawn their curtains. At the fish sheds, Big Martha was already there, sleeves rolled high, hair pinned in a tight coil that looked as unyielding as she did. She glanced up as Thomas slipped inside. "Still breathing, then?" she grunted, tossing him the same dull knife. "Cart's bigger today. We've got a shipment from Grimsby. Gut quick, gut clean." He took his place at the table, next to the older boys whose eyes barely lifted to greet him. The fish lay piled like silver corpses on wet planks, the smell sharp enough to make his eyes sting again. He found a rhythm in the work. Split, scrape, toss. His fingers numb and slick, the cold brine biting through skin and settling deep into his bones. Martha barked orders over the scrape of blades and the thud of gut buckets being emptied. Her voice was harsh, but not cruel. Once, when Thomas sliced too deep and winced as the blade grazed his thumb, she pressed a dirty rag into his hand without a word, then shoved him back toward the table. There was no time to bleed in Billingsgate. The fish did not wait, nor did the men who barked for their catch. Hours blurred. The shed was a world of gray light, slick floors, and the constant rasp of knives on scales. Now and then, the door banged open, and another crate arrived, the men outside laughing hoarsely through cracked lips and coughing into their sleeves. In these moments, Thomas's thoughts drifted to his father. He imagined John somewhere near the docks, his back bent beneath a barrel or curled in sleep behind a stack of crates. Sometimes he let himself believe that his father would appear at the shed door, coat pulled tight, voice rough but warm. "Come on, lad. You've done enough for today. Let's go home." But the door only swung open for crates, and his father did not come. When the last fish was gutted and stacked on ice, Martha handed him 3 pennies this time. She did not praise him, only nodded once, a gesture that felt to Thomas like a small kindness, precious in its rarity. He tucked the coins deep into his coat pocket and stepped out into the daylight, blinking against the haze that rose from the river. He thought of what he could buy. Bread. Yes, maybe a scrap of cheese if the stallholder was willing to break off a bit. His belly cramped at the thought, but he held the coins tight in his palm and turned not toward the bakehouse, but deeper into the maze of lanes that snaked behind the market. There was something he wanted more than bread that day. A promise to himself, stitched together from all the nights he had shivered on stone steps. He found a narrow alley off East Cheap, where a second-hand stall sat under a patchwork awning of tarred canvas. Boots and hats hung like trophies from rusty hooks, and behind the stall, a thin man with an oilskin cap leaned on a crate, smoking a foul pipe that made Thomas's nose wrinkle. "Got coin?" the man asked when Thomas hovered too long before a row of battered boots. Thomas nodded and held out the pennies, careful not to let his hand shake. The man squinted, teeth showing between the whiskers of his chin. He reached up, lifted a pair of boots from the hook, scuffed leather, soles worn thin but better than frost-burnt feet on stone. "Try 'em," he grunted. Thomas sat on the edge of the crate, easing his bruised toes into the boots. They pinched at the sides, but the leather was softer than he had dreamed it would be. He stood, feeling the unfamiliar weight of them, the small barrier between him and the wet, unforgiving street. "How much?" he asked, though he feared the answer. "For you, boy. 3 pennies straight." Thomas's fingers closed around the coins once more. The ache in his belly rose in protest, but the memory of the stone steps, the raw burn of ice against his skin, the nights when he had wrapped rags around his feet until they were damp and useless. These things pushed the hunger aside. He placed the coins in the man's palm, then stood straighter in his new boots. He left the stall with the old pair of rags tucked under his arm. He could sell them, perhaps, for a scrap of coal or a piece of stale bread. As he walked, he felt taller, each step ringing differently against the cobbles. The boots squeaked when they bent, and this small sound filled him with something like pride. It was foolish, maybe. Boots alone would not shield him from the cold, nor fill his belly when work ran dry. But for a moment, they made him feel less like a shadow drifting between wagons and crates. As the day folded itself into dusk, Thomas wandered back toward the docks, boots clicking softly, his eyes drawn to the flicker of lanterns along the wharf. The river rolled by, indifferent and vast, carrying away dreams and bodies alike. He wondered what lay beyond it, beyond London's spires and fog-choked alleys. He dreamed of ships that sailed toward places where the air did not taste of soot and the nights did not creep in so cold. He sat on a low wall by the water, boots dangling above the dark swirl of the Thames. The world smelled of fish and coal smoke and distant bread he could no longer afford. He pressed his chin to his knees, breathing the damp wind, and for a while he let himself drift, his thoughts floating far from the market stalls and the cold stone steps. In that quiet hour, the city seemed almost to sleep too, its noise tucked beneath the rolling tide, just a boy and his new boots, and a promise that tomorrow, perhaps, he would find a way to fill his belly once more. The wind off the Thames carried a sharp bite as the last glow of daylight bled into the black seam of night. Thomas lingered by the river until the cold pushed him back into the narrow tangle of streets. He tugged his coat tighter around him, his new boots whispering over the slick cobblestones, their thin soles already testing his hopes with each wet step. He did not want to return to the church steps that night. The stone had grown too cold, too unwelcoming, now that he had felt the small comfort of warm bread and the weight of coins in his pocket. He needed somewhere softer, somewhere that did not gnaw at his bones. So he drifted deeper into the maze of alleys behind the fish market, drawn by the flicker of fires that sometimes burned in hidden yards where London's forgotten gathered like shadows against the frost. He found them behind an old stable that smelled of straw and damp wood. A circle of figures hunched around a barrel fire, faces flickering in the glow like half-formed ghosts. Some were children like him, their eyes bright and hungry in the dark. Others were older, ragged men with beards grown wild, and women who spoke to the flames in low, murmured prayers. They barely looked up when Thomas approached. New faces came and went every night, swallowed by the streets or the sickness that drifted like smoke through the alleys. A girl with tangled hair and a shawl too thin for the cold shifted to make space for him. She did not ask his name, nor he hers. There were no questions here, only the quiet promise of borrowed warmth. He crouched close, the heat licking at his numb fingers, the fire's crackle mixing with the distant call of night hawkers and the river's slow groan beyond the yard. A man spoke softly, his voice weaving through the hush like an old lullaby. He told a story about when he had been a sailor on a ship bound for India, how the sea had stretched so wide it swallowed the sky, and how the sun there had been strong enough to burn the hunger right out of your belly. The others listened with half-closed eyes, their minds drifting far beyond London's walls to places they would never see. Thomas listened too, his eyelids heavy, his thoughts slipping between the man's words and the soft crackle of burning wood. When the story ended, silence settled over them like a worn blanket. The girl beside Thomas leaned her shoulder against his. He could feel her shivering, her thin frame trembling in time with his own heartbeat. She smelled faintly of soap, a rare, clean scent in this corner of the city. He wondered where she had come from, what door she had slipped through and not returned to. But he did not ask. In the fire's glow, questions seemed like fragile things, best left unspoken. Sleep came in drifting snatches. He would wake to the hiss of embers, the scrape of footsteps as someone rose and shuffled off into the dark, only to be replaced by another drifting figure drawn to the promise of heat. Once, in the deepest hour of night, he startled awake to the sound of soft weeping. He turned his head and saw the girl burying her face in her shawl, her shoulders shaking. He wanted to say something. "It's all right. You're not alone." But the words stuck in his throat like a dry crust. So he shifted closer instead, letting their shared warmth speak the kindness he could not shape with his tongue. By dawn, the fire was dying, reduced to a nest of glowing coals. The yard smelled of ash and unwashed skin. The girl was gone, vanished into the mist before the first bell of morning. Thomas stood, his boots stiff with dew, his legs trembling as the chill crawled back into his bones. He stretched his arms toward the last breath of warmth before pushing his way back into the waking streets. The city was stirring, milk carts creaking over the cobbles, the clang of iron gates lifted to greet the day's trade. He drifted through the haze, the memory of the fire still clinging to his sleeves. He did not go straight to the fish market this time. Instead, he walked toward the river's edge, where small boats bobbed against the wharf. Men were loading sacks of flour, crates of bottled beer, and barrels brimming with salted pork. He watched them work, the easy rhythm of their shoulders, the heavy thud of boots on wet planks. One man noticed him standing there, a tall figure with shoulders like the hull of a barge and a scar that split his eyebrow in two. He squinted at Thomas, then jerked his chin. "Oi, boy, fancy your arms stronger than they look?" Thomas hesitated, then stepped closer, his heart thumping at the chance. "Yes, sir." The man barked a laugh, rough but not unkind. "Sir, is it? I've been called worse. We need another back to load crates. 1 shilling for the morning's work if you don't drop nothing. That suit your fancy?" A shilling. More than 3 days gutting fish. Thomas nodded so fast his neck ached. The man slapped a rough palm against his shoulder, spinning him toward the ramp. The work was back-breaking, hefting crates nearly half his weight, his boots slipping on wet planks slick with river slime. More than once, he nearly pitched forward into the cold current below, but the thought of a whole shilling kept his arms steady and his legs braced. Hours passed in a blur of shouted orders and the taste of salt on his tongue. His muscles burned, but beneath the ache pulsed a fragile, warming pride, stronger than a boy on church steps, stronger than a shivering shadow by a barrel fire. When the last crate was stowed and the man pressed a single silver coin into his palm, Thomas could have wept from the strange, dizzy joy of it. He stepped back onto the wharf, the shilling cold and bright in his pocket. For the first time in weeks, he felt something like tomorrow, a thin, flickering promise that perhaps, just perhaps, he might outrun the chill of London stones a little longer. So he turned his boots toward the market once more, the river behind him sighing its endless lullaby as the city unfolded its gray wings for another day. The weight of the shilling in Thomas's pocket felt almost unreal as he trudged away from the docks, his legs trembling with fatigue and his shoulders aching from the burden of crates hefted one after another under the rough barks of rivermen. The morning light was still young, thin beams of sun clawing through the mist and smoke that forever hovered over the Thames like an old, tattered curtain. He paused by an old brick wall near the fish market, leaning his back against the cold, rough surface. He pulled the shilling from his pocket and held it up, turning it over in the pale light. It caught the sun for a moment, flashing bright, a small silver miracle. A full shilling. It felt like holding a piece of another life, a tiny doorway through which he could glimpse something more than fish guts, frostbitten toes, and the empty ache of hunger. His stomach grumbled, sharp and insistent, reminding him that the promise of coins meant little without bread in his belly. He pushed away from the wall and began to weave through the waking market. The fishmongers were already bellowing prices, slapping cod onto tables still slick from yesterday's trade. He slipped past them, past the girls with baskets of wilting flowers, and the ragmen who lurked in corners, waiting to trade scraps for coppers. He found the same bakehouse as before, its windows steamed with the warmth of ovens working through the dawn. He stepped inside and felt the heat wrap around him like a soft shawl, melting the sting in his fingers. The same stout woman stood behind the counter, arms folded, eyes sharp as a hawk's. "You again," she said, voice rough but not unkind. "Got coin this time, do you?" Thomas nodded, lifting his shilling with cautious pride. The woman's eyebrows rose a fraction, and she turned to pull down a small loaf, round and golden, the crust still singing with heat. "Take this, and I'll give you a mug of broth besides. You look like you'll fall where you stand." Thomas took the bread in both hands, afraid it might vanish if he blinked too long. He followed her gesture to a low bench by the wall and sat, curling his thin frame over the treasure in his lap. When she brought the tin mug, its contents steaming, the scent rich with onion and marrow, he could have cried, but he did not. Instead, he tore the bread apart in careful pieces, dipping each into the broth, chewing slowly, letting the warmth chase the cold from his ribs. Around him, the little bakehouse hummed with the soft clatter of early customers, porters grabbing rolls for the road, girls wrapping bread in scraps of cloth to take back to mothers who waited in dark rooms. He watched them all, the quiet shuffle of people like him, poor, tired, half forgotten by the grand city they fed with their bones and breath. When he finished the last bite, the woman came to take the empty mug. She saw the shilling still clutched in his hand, only a few coins lighter now. "Save it," she said, her voice softer than before. "Don't let the drunks see it flash, mind you. And watch the boys with quick fingers. There's always one waiting when you look away." Thomas nodded, tucking the remaining coins deep into his coat. He slipped back into the street where the cold had softened under a weak sun, though the wind still tugged at his sleeves like a restless child. He thought of Big Martha at the fish sheds and the scarred man at the docks. If he was clever, he could work both, mornings with crates, afternoons with knives. He would sleep less, eat more, and maybe one day he might save enough to rent a corner in one of the tenements where the rain did not find you every night. As he walked, he caught sight of Bram again, perched by a stack of empty barrels, his beard tangled with crumbs from some unseen meal. Bram's eyes flicked to Thomas's boots, then to the boy's face. "New boots," Bram rasped, voice wheezing through yellow teeth. "You're on your way then, eh? London'll take those boots right off you if you're not watchful." Thomas gave him half a smile. "They're tight enough, Bram. Won't slip off easy." The old man cackled, a sound like dry leaves. "Aye, you say that now? You say that now." He said nothing more, just leaned back into his patchwork coat, his gaze drifting past Thomas to something only he could see. Memories or ghosts, or maybe just the fog curling off the river. Thomas watched him for a moment longer, then moved on, the shilling's weight steady against his thigh. He followed the curve of the street back toward Billingsgate. Martha would want him for the afternoon gutting. There was always more fish, always more to be done. But before he slipped back into the world of scales and brine, he found himself drawn to the edge of the market square, where a cluster of children gathered around a street performer. The man wore a battered top hat and spun stories as easily as a dockhand hefted crates. His voice rose and fell like the tide, weaving tales of highwaymen and haunted abbeys, of kings who disguised themselves to walk among common folk. The children clung to every word, eyes wide, breath frosting in the morning air. Thomas lingered at the edge of the circle, letting the words wash over him like a warm tide. For a few minutes, he forgot the weight of the knife handle, the chill of river wind, the ache in his belly. He stood there, one more ragged shadow among many, dreaming of places where boots did not wear through, where a single shilling could buy not just bread and broth, but safety, softness, something like home. When the story ended, he stepped away before the hat passed for coins. He could not spare more than what he needed to keep tomorrow alive. So he slipped back through the chatter of the market, the smell of fish and wood smoke rising to greet him like an old friend. His boots clicked along the stones, his mind already drifting to Martha's shed and the promise of another handful of pennies. And so Thomas kept moving, one step at a time through London's belly, the city's cold breath always at his neck, his dreams stitched tight around a silver coin and a pair of second-hand boots that squeaked with every stubborn stride into the waiting dusk. By the time Thomas reached the sheds behind Billingsgate, the daylight had grown soft and gray again, the brief promise of sun swallowed back into the belly of London's eternal mist. He ducked beneath the low eaves where fishmongers shouted and boys scurried like mice, their arms red to the elbows from cold brine and sharp blades. Big Martha spotted him the moment he slipped inside, her eyes narrowing in her broad, wind-creased face. "Late, are you?" she barked, though her mouth twitched at the corner like she might have smiled if the city hadn't taught her better. "Was working the docks," Thomas said quickly, pulling the shilling from his pocket just enough to prove the truth of it. Martha snorted and flicked her knife in his direction. "Docks'll break your back quicker than gutting fish will, and break your skull if you're not quick with your tongue. Don't get too bold, boy." He nodded, slipping the coin back into his coat. He could feel its cold edge pressing through the thin fabric, both a comfort and a weight that reminded him how easily it could vanish if he stumbled into the wrong alley. Martha shoved a bucket at him, her hand rough but steady. "Cod today. They've been in the barrels since last night. Soft bellies, easy work if you keep the blade sharp. Finish the stack, you'll get your pay. And if you slice your thumb off, don't bleed on the fish." Thomas took his place at the long plank table, wedged between a pair of older boys whose shoulders were hunched high against the chill. The fish lay in a heap beside him, gray-white bodies, eyes glazed in a stare that never changed. He settled into the rhythm, the scrape of the blade through slick flesh, the soft slap of guts into the bucket at his feet. The stink didn't bother him now. It was the scent of pennies, of bread rolls and warm broth, and the chance to keep his boots a little longer. Beside him, the older boy to his right, Ewan, he thought his name was, hummed under his breath as he worked. A low tune without words that slipped between the knives like a thin thread holding the whole shed together. Thomas glanced at him once, but Ewan didn't meet his eyes. Here, everyone was busy with their own thoughts, their own quiet bargains struck with the city. Hours bled by. Now and then, Martha barked at one of the boys to keep his hands moving. Outside, the light faded until the cracks between the planks glowed orange with lantern light and the passing flicker of gas lamps in the street beyond. Somewhere out there, fine folk drifted toward theaters and supper tables, heavy with roast beef and sugared puddings. Here, the boys bent over fish guts, their bellies aching for scraps they would never taste. When the last cod was split and stacked on ice, Martha came down the line, her apron stiff with dried scales. She dropped a few pennies into each boy's palm. When she reached Thomas, she paused, her thumb brushing over the new boots peeking from under his frayed trousers. "Good boots," she muttered, low enough so the others wouldn't hear. "Keep your eyes on 'em. There's rats in this city that walk on 2 legs and fancy boots more than cheese." Thomas managed a smile, his cheeks cracking where the cold had chapped them raw. "Thank you, Martha," she grunted, then clapped him on the shoulder hard enough to jolt him toward the door. He slipped back out into the night, the air sharp in his lungs, his pockets a little heavier, his fingers raw and stinging beneath the crust of dried salt. The street beyond the sheds was alive with the low growl of London after dark, shadows shifting behind fogged windows, the clip of hooves on cobbles, the rustle of skirts as women slipped between pools of lantern light. He turned toward the small alley where he'd found the barrel fire the night before, thinking maybe he'd find the girl there again, the one with the soap smell in her hair and the soft shoulder against his own. But when he arrived, the yard behind the stables was empty, save for the black circle of ash where the fire had burned. Only the silence remained, heavy as a tomb. Thomas crouched beside the cold pit, brushing his fingers through the charred cinders as if they might hold some lingering warmth. He imagined the girl's voice, though he'd never heard it. He wondered if she'd found her way to some shelter, or if the city had taken her the way it took so many, swallowed into dark corners where no one asked your name and no one remembered you once you were gone. A gust of wind rattled through the broken boards above him, pulling him back to his feet. He checked the coins in his pocket, counting them twice beneath the faint glow of a distant street lamp. Enough for bread. Maybe a bit of cheese again, if he rose early and caught the stalls before the good scraps vanished into bigger hands. Enough, if he was careful, to make tomorrow feel a little less like today. He pulled his coat tighter, the new boots scuffing softly as he stepped back onto the street. The city stretched before him, endless and hungry. Somewhere, Bram would be perched near the docks, spinning riddles to the fog. Somewhere, men in high hats would ride carriages past the gaslights, never glancing down at the boy whose boots squeaked against the stone. Thomas lowered his head against the wind and walked on, one step after another, deeper into the restless night. In his pocket, the silver coin pressed against his skin, a small, stubborn promise that though London was cold and brutal and vast, he would not let it swallow him just yet. That night, Thomas did not sleep on the church steps, nor did he return to the cold circle of ash behind the old stable. Instead, he wandered through the narrow veins of the city until he found himself pressed against the low wall of a yard behind a row of warehouses near the river. There, hidden from the constable's lamps and the drunks stumbling from taverns, he settled into a hollow where the wind could not bite so deep. He drew his coat around him, tucking his knees to his chest, and let the thrum of the city lull him toward sleep. The Thames was never silent. Even in the darkest hours, the river murmured and shifted, iron chains clinking against stone, the hulls of barges groaning in the current. Thomas listened to it, that slow heartbeat of London, the steady whisper that reminded him he was still here, still breathing, still hungry for the small, bright promise of tomorrow. When dawn came, it came without warmth. A pale light slid down the brick walls and found Thomas huddled in his hollow, his boots stiff with dew, his breath clouding the morning air. He flexed his fingers, sore from knives and crates and the cold that settled in his bones no matter how tightly he curled himself up. His first thought was for food. His second was for work. The coins in his pocket were fewer than they had been yesterday, and though the shilling's edge still kissed his palm like a secret, he knew better than to spend it all at once. Better to keep it hidden, his seed for another day when the river offered no crates, and Martha had no fish to gut. He rose, boots scuffing against the wall as he stepped back onto the waking street. The city was stirring. Costermongers wheeling barrows stacked with bruised apples and onions, chimney sweeps black as shadows clinging to ladders twice their height, and the dull thud of hooves as milk carts rattled past puddles still glazed with frost. Near the market's edge, he spotted a stall draped in canvas where a woman sold yesterday's bread at half price. He counted out 2 pennies, and traded them for a dense heel of rye that smelled faintly of caraway. He ate as he walked, tearing small pieces and pressing them to his tongue, chewing until each crumb felt like a feast. He did not return to Billingsgate straight away. Instead, he drifted down toward the docks again, hoping the scarred man might be there with another chance to carry crates. The tide was high and restless, the ships creaking at their moorings, ropes taut as harp strings. He found the man near a stack of barrels, arguing with a pair of porters who looked half awake and half soused. Thomas hovered at the edge of the shadows until the man's good eye caught him. "Boy," he barked, waving off the porters. "Come to break your back again, have you?" Thomas nodded, swallowing the last of his bread. The man grunted, more pleased than cross. He tossed a coil of rope at Thomas's feet. "Help lash the barrels. Keep your knots tight, or we'll lose half the stock to the Thames, and I'll see your boots floating off with it." Thomas set to work, fingers clumsy at first, but the man showed him once, twice, how to twist the rope, how to brace the barrel so it didn't buck against him like a restless mule. The wind off the river bit through his coat, but he welcomed the sting. It reminded him he was moving, earning, that he would eat again tonight if he did not slip and drown beneath the hull. They worked until the tide began to roll back, pulling the river's dark tongue away from the wharf. By then, Thomas's shoulders burned and his palms were raw where the rope had gnawed through the thin skin. But when the last barrel was tied, the man pressed another coin into his palm, smaller than yesterday's shilling, but enough to mean bread, maybe even a slice of pie if he found the right stall at the right time. "Good hands, boy," the man said, squinting at him through the morning haze. "Don't waste 'em on pickpockets and gin when you can use 'em honest. London's got too many lads who'd rather lose their teeth in an alley than earn an honest copper." Thomas tucked the coin deep into his pocket and nodded. He wanted to say thank you, to say that he wouldn't waste a single coin or a single knot if it meant he could stand straighter tomorrow. But his tongue stuck behind his teeth, so he only nodded again and slipped back into the swirl of the street. He found himself near the rag and bone man's stall by mid-morning. The old fellow stood beneath a crooked sign painted with a single word, rags, though he bought and sold more than that. Bottles, scraps of cloth, broken combs, dented spoons. Anything that might be mended and traded again for a farthing or two. Thomas fingered the rags he'd kept from his old shoes, balled up and hidden in his coat since the day he'd bought the boots. He pulled them free and offered them across the rickety counter. "2 pennies, the man said without looking up, voice flat as ditch water. Thomas took it, no bargaining, no complaint. He folded the coins into the warm hollow of his palm. 2 pennies, another crust of bread. Another night with something in his belly besides the ache. As he walked away, he caught sight of Bram perched on an old iron bollard, pipe smoke curling around his battered hat. The old man's eyes twinkled when he spotted Thomas's boots. "Still got 'em, eh?" Bram croaked. "Told you, didn't I? City'll try and walk off with 'em soon as you blink." Thomas smiled, thin but true. "They're mine," he said. Bram cackled, tapping ash from his pipe onto the stones. "Yours today. Mind you, keep 'em yours tomorrow." And with that, Thomas turned back toward Billingsgate, the boots tight on his feet, the coins warm in his pocket, and the sound of the river behind him like a promise that London's cold teeth had not found his bones. At least, not yet. When Thomas slipped back into Billingsgate that afternoon, the market was at its rowdiest. Fishwives shouting prices high enough to drown out the bray of carters, and the clatter of crates striking wet cobbles. The smell was worse than ever. The air, thick with salt and scales, and the sharp tang of yesterday's catch, gone soft around the edges. Big Martha spotted him before he'd taken 3 steps past the barrels. She was elbow deep in a tub of herring, her sleeves rolled and her apron stiff with salt. She jerked her chin at him, eyes narrowing just enough to let him know he'd best not think himself too fine for the work now that he'd tasted coin at the docks. "Still got your hands, then?" She called over the din, her voice like the crack of a cart whip. Thomas lifted his palms, rough and rope-burned, but still working. Martha snorted, half approving, half amused. "Good. Barrels of herring today. Bigger than cod, bones sharper, stink worse. You keep your knife quick, or they'll slice you back." He nodded and joined the line at the gutting table. Ewan was there again, sleeves already soaked to the elbow, humming his tuneless song under his breath. He slid over just enough to give Thomas room, never breaking the steady motion of knife and wrist and bucket scrape. Thomas fell into rhythm beside him. The barrel beside him brimmed with herring, slick as river stones, their dull eyes catching the shed's lantern light like tiny mirrors. The first cut was always the hardest, cold flesh parting beneath the dull blade, the slippery fight to keep the fish from twisting in his grip. But soon the motion settled into muscle and breath. Slice, scrape, toss. Slice, scrape, toss. The shed echoed with it, like the ticking of some vast, wet clock counting the hours until dusk. Now and then, Martha would pass behind them, barking at a boy too slow, cursing at one who let his bucket spill onto the stone floor. She did not stop for Thomas this time. She only nodded once when she passed, a tiny approval that made his shoulders square just a bit, despite the ache in his arms. Outside, the daylight shifted toward dusk. The cold crept in through the plank walls, threading around ankles and wrists, biting any scrap of skin not hidden beneath coat or rag. The older boys complained in low voices, muttering about the fever that stalked the alleys come winter, how it slipped through cracks and keyholes, curled into lungs like smoke, and carried you off before dawn if you were foolish enough to sleep with wet boots and an empty belly. Thomas listened, but did not speak. He could feel the hunger pressing behind his ribs again, but he had coins in his pocket now. Small, cold reminders that tonight he could buy bread, even a wedge of cheese if the monger didn't swat him away with a broom. And if tomorrow brought crates at the docks and the next day more barrels at Billingsgate, then maybe, just maybe, he could keep the fever at bay, keep the frost from slipping down his collar while he slept. By the time the last barrel was emptied and the floor washed of guts and scales, Martha clapped him on the shoulder. Hard, like always. She dropped 4 pennies into his palm, heavy and warm. "Good work," she said, voice rough but steady. "If you keep your hands quick and your mouth shut, you'll always find a place here. Just mind you don't catch a blade instead of a fish." Thomas curled his fingers around the coins and ducked his head in thanks. He did not trust his voice just then. There was something in his chest, like the warmth of the bakehouse, like the girl's shoulder against his by the barrel fire, that made words catch behind his tongue. He stepped back into the street, boots scuffing through puddles that glowed with the last spit of lantern light. The market behind him buzzed softer now, its roar dulled to the low chatter of hawkers packing away what scraps could be sold to the ragged line of mothers and hungry men waiting with outstretched hands. Thomas slipped between them, careful not to brush too close. Pockets were light here, hands lighter still. Near the edge of the market, he found a baker closing up his stall. The man was red-faced and thick around the middle, his apron dusted white as a winter field. He had a basket of misshapen loaves, burned at the edge, cracked down the middle, the sort that would not fetch good coin in the morning rush. Thomas waited until the last proper customer turned away, then stepped forward, thumb pressed tight to his hidden pennies. "Any scraps left, sir?" he asked, careful, polite. Never beg, ask. The baker grunted, eyeing the boy's boots, the raw lines of salt and fish blood still drying under his fingernails. "Got coppers?" Thomas nodded, held out 2. The man dug into the basket and pulled free a small round loaf, darker at the edge than at the middle, but still warm when Thomas clutched it to his chest. He nearly smiled. Nearly. "Thank you, sir," he said, and ducked away before the man could wave him off. He did not eat the bread straight away. Instead, he slipped down a side alley, boots soft on stone, until he found a spot beneath a half-collapsed awning where the wind could not find him so quickly. He sat there in the dusk, bread warm in his hands, coins safe in his coat. He tore the first bite free with careful teeth, chewing slow, tasting every crumb. Above him, London breathed its endless smoke into the night. Around him, somewhere in the fog, 1,000 boys like him crouched in doorways, curled in churchyards, bent over barrels and crates, their hunger singing in the same quiet tune. Thomas chewed his bread and listened to that tune. And as the night wrapped its cold arms around him once more, he promised himself that tomorrow, when the barrels came, when the crates rolled off the boats, when Martha's knife found fish flesh slick beneath his hands, he would be ready. He would stand, boots tight on his feet, shilling warm in his pocket, heart stubborn enough to face London's bitter dawn once again. By the time the stars fought their way through London's gauzy veil of coal smoke and river mist, Thomas had eaten every crumb of his hard-earned loaf. He sat with his back pressed to the damp bricks, knees drawn up beneath his coat, and watched the glow of distant lamps flicker in and out of view each time the fog rolled thick across the alley's mouth. The warmth of bread in his belly dulled the ache in his arms, made the city's sharp teeth seem, for a little while, like something he could outrun. He drifted in and out of sleep there, half listening to the muted song of London at night, the distant clop of horses on wet cobbles, the slurred curses of drunks stumbling from gin shops, the soft scurry of rats hunting scraps along the gutter. Somewhere down the alley, a baby's thin wail rose and fell, answered only by the hush of the fog pressing its cold lips to every door and window it found. When he woke for good, dawn was a pale smudge against the rooftops, the first hints of daybreak fighting through the grime that hung heavy over the city. Thomas stretched his legs, feeling the stiffness in his back from curling against stone and wood. He rose, boots scraping the grit of the alley, and took stock of his pockets by touch alone. 2 pennies left from the night before, plus the hidden shilling pressed deep into a seam he'd stitched shut himself with a stolen needle and a scrap of string. He thought of Bram's words. London'll take those boots right off you if you're not watchful. So he was watchful now. Watchful of the coin, watchful of the boots, watchful of the street around him, where eyes like his own waited for a slip, a stumble, a chance. Before the city fully roused, Thomas pushed his way down to the river's edge again. The tide was low, the boats squatting heavy in the mud like old dogs resting tired bones. He found the scarred man near a stack of crates marked with chalk, tea, sugar, sacks of flour that smelled faintly of warm places far from London's endless gray. Back again, the man grunted when he saw Thomas. His scar twisted as he spoke, giving his eye a permanent squint that seemed to measure every boy for weight and worth. If you'll have me, Thomas said, voice steady, though he could feel the tremble in his legs from standing too quick after so little sleep. The man spat to the side, then jerked his head toward the crates. Coin's the same, works no softer. Thomas set to it without complaint. He heaved sacks that left his shoulders burning, balanced barrels twice his size with his back braced against the cold slap of river wind. Once he stumbled on a slick patch of planks and nearly pitched into the black water below. The man's barked laugh rang behind him, sharp but not cruel. Mind your feet, boy. The river's colder than the street, and she don't give back what she takes. Thomas grinned through gritted teeth and adjusted his grip on the rope binding the barrels. He thought of Martha's fish shed waiting later, its stink and warmth and pennies tucked into his hand at the end of each long day. Between the docks and the fish, there was enough work to keep him moving. Enough coin to keep the cold from eating him whole, at least for now. By noon, his palms were raw and his arms hung heavy as wet laundry from his shoulders. The scarred man slapped a copper coin into his palm and a half roll of bread into the other, a rough kindness that tasted better than any meat pie could have done. Eat before the gulls snatch it, the man said, and come back tomorrow if your back's still straight. Thomas sat on the low stone wall by the wharf, the river lapping slow and thick against the boats behind him. He ate the bread in careful bites, eyes flicking toward the broad-backed gulls that wheeled overhead, their cries sharp as the city's endless hunger. Every crumb he guarded like the shilling sewn into his coat, small pieces of survival, each one a promise that the city hadn't bested him yet. When the bread was gone and the coin tucked safe beside its brothers, Thomas rose and turned his boots back toward Billingsgate. The afternoon crowds were gathering already, boys with empty buckets waiting for the offcuts, mothers dragging children with cheeks red from the cold, men with eyes as hollow as their pockets. The smell of fish hit him like a slap when he pushed through the shed door. But to Thomas, it smelled like work, like coins in the palm, like another night with bread instead of gnawing emptiness. Big Martha was there as ever, sleeves rolled to her elbows, hair pinned tight as a knot of rope. She raised one thick brow when she saw him, taking in his slumped shoulders, the new bruises on his knuckles. Been at the docks again, have you? She asked, voice low but not unkind. Thomas nodded, setting his feet wide against the slick boards as he accepted the dull knife she pressed into his palm. "Well enough," Martha said. "So long as you don't drop dead in my shed. There's herring piled to the ceiling, boy. Get to it." And so he did. Knife moving, bucket filling, the smell of brine wrapping him like the fog beyond the shed walls. Around him, other boys worked in silence, the rhythm of the fish gutting like a lullaby made of steel and salt. In that small, sour-smelling world, Thomas felt the city's bite ease for a moment. The coins in his pocket were safe. The boots still held fast around his feet. And somewhere in the hidden corners of London's dark belly, a boy with salt on his hands and hunger in his bones could still carve out a place for himself, slice by slice, coin by coin, day by stubborn day. When the day's last fish had been gutted and the floor rinsed clean of scales and brine, the sheds of Billingsgate fell into a hush that was almost gentle. The shouting of the market dulled to a low murmur beyond the doors as the final wagons creaked away under the lantern glow. Big Martha moved down the line of boys like a watchful mother hawk, dropping copper coins into raw, outstretched palms. When she reached Thomas, she paused, her eyes catching on the ragged sleeves of his coat and the line of bruises that marked his forearms like the shadows of ropes. "Back again tomorrow?" she asked, voice as rough as the stone floor beneath their feet. Thomas nodded, pressing his lips tight to hold in the groan rising from his sore shoulders. Martha gave a grunt that could have been approval, then pressed 4 pennies into his hand, one more than yesterday. She did not wait for thanks, only turned away to bark at a pair of older boys dawdling near the shed door. Pocketing the coins, Thomas slipped out into the lane behind the market. The dusk was soft and damp, the last threads of daylight clinging stubbornly to the edges of rooftops before the gas lamps flickered to life. The smell of the river drifted in, salt and sewage, a constant reminder that the city's heart never truly slept. His stomach gave a low, hollow growl that echoed through his thin ribs. He turned his boots, still stiff but holding, toward the maze of alleys he'd come to know so well. There was a baker's window not far from Eastcheap, where stale pies sometimes sat waiting for late buyers, too desperate to care if the crust was cracked or the filling dry. He kept his head down as he passed knots of older boys lurking near corners, their eyes glinting sharp in the lamplight. They watched every pocket, every loose string, every slip of a boot heel. When he reached the pie seller's window, he stood on tiptoe to peer through the fogged glass. A woman with hair like an old broomstick squinted back at him. She saw the pennies pinched tight in his fingers and gave him a nod that was more business than kindness. "For 2pence this one," she rasped, pulling out a misshapen wedge of meat pie, its crust flaking away at the edges. Thomas laid the coins on the sill before she could change her mind. She pushed the pie through a crack in the window, wrapped in a scrap of old newspaper still smudged with half-legible headlines. He stepped away quickly, tucking the warm bundle into his coat as though it were a bar of gold. A few streets away, he found a low wall behind an apothecary's back door, where the heat from inside bled faintly through the bricks. He crouched there, pie cradled in his lap, and unwrapped it with careful fingers. The crust crumbled under his touch, but the smell, grease and pepper and something faintly sweet, set his mouth watering so fiercely he nearly laughed at the hunger of it. He ate in slow bites, letting each mouthful linger against his tongue. He could almost pretend, there in that quiet strip of warmth behind the chemist's door, that he was not one slip away from the stone steps and the frost again. The pie was gone too quickly, leaving only grease stains on the old newspaper and a warmth that pooled in his belly for the first time that day. Above him, the lamplighter made his rounds, lifting the glass panes one by one with a long hooked pole. Each flame flickered to life and cast a shaky circle against the mist. Thomas watched him work, steady, sure, unbothered by the shadows that pressed at the edges of every pool of light. He wondered what it might feel like to light the city instead of crawling through its dark. When he rose, he stretched his arms overhead, feeling the knots in his shoulders crack and pull like old rope. The shilling in his coat was still there, sewn deep where no quick fingers could snatch it without tearing the coat clean from his back. His boots still squeaked faintly with each step, a sound that comforted him more than it annoyed him now. They meant he was not barefoot on the stones. They meant he still had tomorrow. He drifted back toward the river, weaving through the sleeping market, past wagons rattling empty toward distant yards. The fog curled thicker near the docks, swallowing the lamps and softening the clang of iron and the low mutter of men still hauling crates into the deeper hours of night. He wondered if the scarred man would still be there at first light, another pile of barrels waiting to test his arms and back. At the edge of the wharf, he paused by a bollard where Bram often perched, but tonight the old man was gone, vanished into some secret nook or tumble-down corner only he knew. Thomas wondered if the ghostly shape of Bram's coat would appear beside him come dawn, the old man's voice rasping warnings about boots and quick hands and London's sharp, hungry teeth. For now, there was only the creak of moored boats and the slow hush of water licking at the stone steps. Thomas sat there for a time, chin resting on his knees, the cold stone seeping through the seat of his trousers. He felt the shilling like a warm ember against his chest, the weight of copper coins pressing into his palm as he counted and recounted them in the dark. Tomorrow, there would be fish guts and crates and the endless ache in his shoulders. Tomorrow, there would be sharp eyes waiting to pick his pockets clean if he stumbled. But tomorrow, too, there would be bread, maybe even broth if the pennies stretched far enough, and boots still tied firm around his feet. And so, with the river sighing at his back, Thomas let his eyes drift closed, London's breath curling cold around him while he dreamed of another dawn. One more day to stand, to work, to hold the city's hunger at bay for just a little while longer. In the 11th part of our quiet wander through the darkened streets and hidden alleys of Victorian London, let us slip behind the curtain that separates the grand parlors of the well-to-do from the flickering hearths of the working poor. For within the boundaries of this sprawling city, there existed countless souls who lived not in the roar of the bustling thoroughfares, but in the hush of dim rooms, where the weight of survival pressed upon their chests like a stone at dusk. Imagine a boarding house in Bethnal Green, its narrow brick face wedged between two crooked shops. One a greengrocer's that could scarcely keep its vegetables fresh, the other a pawn shop with its 3 brass balls swinging gently above the door, reflecting the yellowish light of gas lamps. In this boarding house lived a seamstress named Martha Lively. Her surname was no true reflection of her condition, for what was lively within her had long been stitched away into the garments of strangers. Each dawn, Martha's fingers worked with a stubborn determination, coaxing threads through coarse fabric under the watchful eye of her landlady, Mrs. Beadley, who owned the rooms and took a portion of every shilling Martha earned. There were 6 boarders in that house, each paying not with certainty, but with whatever coins they might collect after days spent bent over work tables or standing for hours in a factory's clang and clatter. Martha's room was scarcely larger than a cupboard. 1 bed, 1 chair, a basin with a hairline crack, and a window that rarely opened. Yet through that window, Martha could peer out and see the backs of other tenements, rows of chimneys breathing sooty sighs into the air, and once in a while, the figure of a child leaning from another window, curious eyes wide in a face grown pale from stale air and scant meals. In such lodgings, privacy was an imagined luxury. The thin walls offered no shelter from the coughs, murmurs, and quiet weeping that drifted from room to room like wandering spirits. Sometimes at night, Martha would press her ear to the wall and listen to the whispers of her neighbor, an old coachman named Thomas, who had once driven the wealthiest of Londoners through the city's grand avenues. Now his voice cracked with memories, reliving nights when gaslight spilled like molten gold upon velvet seats while he perched in the cold, hoping for a copper or two to warm his pocket. To hear him was to be reminded that even the respectable could tumble down the rungs of fortune, landing in the same damp corridors as the ragged. Such knowledge weighed on Martha's dreams, for she too had known better days. A father who worked as a clerk, a mother who once sang to her by the fireside before fever carried her away one winter, leaving Martha to the mercy of an uncle who preferred drink to guardianship. So she sewed. By candlelight, by the grudging glow of the street lamps beyond the glass, Martha stitched until her fingers grew red and swollen, the thimble pressing a permanent dent into her thumb. The garments she made would grace the daughters of merchants and doctors. Fine dresses trimmed with modest lace and tiny buttons that gleamed in the gaslight of middle-class parlors. She imagined those girls at dances and dinners, their laughter ringing off the walls, while she sat hunched over her needle, the scraps of cloth gathering at her feet like fallen petals. Once, when she was 14, Martha had dreamed of becoming a teacher, instructing little girls with bright ribbons in their hair, guiding them through words and numbers until their minds bloomed like gardens in spring. But teaching required more than a dream. It required time, books, recommendations, and sometimes even the good word of a family who could vouch for one's character. And when life offers you only the quick exchange of labor for pennies, dreams are the first to be pawned. Yet in the boarding house, not all was sorrow and unspoken sighs. There was, too, a sort of camaraderie, a fragile thread that bound the boarders together in their shared misfortune. In the evenings, when the day's toil was folded away with the scraps, they would gather in the tiny common room, where Mrs. Beadley kept a small stove fueled by bits of coal scavenged from the street or pinched from deliveries meant for grander houses. There, Martha would sit with Thomas the coachman, Annie the washerwoman, and Ned, a boy of barely 12 who sold newspapers at the corner of Whitechapel Road. They shared tea when they had it, or hot water flavored with nothing but warmth. They spoke little of dreams. They spoke instead of the weather, of rumors drifting through London streets, and sometimes, if the mood was kind, of small moments of beauty. The way the dawn light turned the rooftops pink, or how the snow muffled the city's roar into a hush that made it almost bearable. One night, after a long day stitching sleeves and collars that would never touch her own skin, Martha sat by the stove, her hands cupped around a cracked mug. Thomas told them of the time he had driven a carriage for a baronet who fancied himself a poet. The baronet had insisted on riding through Hyde Park at dusk, reciting lines to the empty trees, while Thomas guided the horses through the frost. The memory made them laugh, soft, cautious laughter that flickered like the stove's tiny flame. Outside, the wind rattled the windows. The city beyond the door still pulsed with its contradictions. Grand dinners in Mayfair, slop buckets emptied into the gutters of Shoreditch, street lamps that cast both safety and shadows in equal measure. And in the boarding house, Martha felt the small comfort of knowing that here, at least, there were others who understood the weary dance of survival. When the laughter faded and the others drifted to their narrow beds, Martha lingered by the dying embers, watching the glow shift and fade like her childhood dreams. She did not feel sorry for herself. Not truly. Pity was too heavy a burden to carry alongside her sewing. Instead, she felt a quiet defiance, a promise whispered to no one but the walls, that as long as she could sew, she would endure. And perhaps, when she closed her eyes, she might see a glimpse of that classroom she once imagined. A place where small hands reached for knowledge instead of coins, and where the air smelled of ink and chalk instead of stale bread and unwashed floors. So she rose, pinched out the last glow of the stove, and crept back to her cupboard room, where the moon traced a pale pattern across her pillow. Outside, London murmured and coughed and dreamed its fractured dreams, while Martha Lively, seamstress of Bethnal Green, closed her eyes and drifted into a sleep both restless and resolute, another soul stitched into the brutal, breathing fabric of Victorian life. In this next turning of our lantern through the gaslit labyrinth of Victorian London, let us drift from Martha's cramped quarters to the river's restless edge, where the Thames curled its cold arm around the city like a watchful serpent. Here, on the water's dark shoulder, lived another hidden existence, one not penned in boarding houses or stitched in poor parlors, but bobbing and swaying atop the currents in rotting boats and makeshift rafts that served as homes to those too poor even for the cheapest room. It was on such a riverboat that young Samuel Finn found himself at the tender age of 15. He had been born in a rookeried alley of Southwark, the third son of a lighterman who ferried cargo across the Thames long before the grand bridges had stitched the city's two halves more tightly together. Samuel's father had died when Samuel was but a boy of 7, crushed beneath a falling crate of timber, leaving his mother and siblings to fend for themselves in a world that offered little charity to widows with too many mouths. For a time, Samuel had worked the docks, hauling ropes, shouting hoarse greetings at sailors, earning half pennies for errands that broke his back before they lined his pockets. But work on land was fickle, and so he drifted back to the river, sleeping on old barges moored to mossy posts, making his bed among coils of rope and damp sails, the lullaby of the water slapping the hull soothing him to uneasy dreams. Each dawn, the Thames was alive with more than tides and mist. It carried secrets. The cries of street hawkers drifting from the embankment, the mutter of smugglers beneath the arches of bridges, the clang of dock workers laboring in the ghostly gray before sunrise. Samuel knew the river's moods, when it was gentle and glassy under moonlight, when it swelled and threatened to spill its brackish belly into the city's lower quarters, drowning cellars and soaking the dreams of the poor. He earned his keep however he could, sometimes honest work, sometimes less so. He might help unload a cargo of tea one morning, then by nightfall find himself guiding a small rowboat for a smuggler who paid him to ferry crates under cover of fog. He did not trouble himself much with questions of right and wrong. For boys like Samuel, the difference was often only the price of being caught. His favorite place was an old coal barge beached against the muddy bank near Wapping, Anming. It no longer sailed, but served as a floating shelter for riverfolk with nowhere else to turn. It was there that Samuel met old Bram, a man whose beard was as tangled as the fishing nets he mended by lamplight. Bram had once captained a schooner that traded as far as Lisbon and Antwerp, but fortune had run aground for him too, and now he presided over the coal barge like a king without a kingdom. In the evenings, when the city's roar softened to a distant murmur and the tide rocked the barge with the gentleness of a cradle, Bram would tell Samuel stories of storms at sea and nights in foreign harbors. Samuel listened, wide-eyed, dreaming of the salt wind on his face, imagining himself not as a ragged river boy, but as a sailor standing proud on a deck bound for lands where the sun burned hot and the water shimmered clear. Yet each morning brought him back to the chill reality of London's muddy veins. There were times the river betrayed him, when the fog grew so thick that he lost his way between moorings and nearly tipped his boat beneath a bridge's stone lip. There were days when the water stank of refuse and the bloated bodies of drowned dogs or worse, and Samuel would hold a rag to his nose as he rowed, reminding himself that the river gave and the river took. Sometimes, when work was scarce, Samuel begged at the steps of the riverside inns, eyes wide and voice low, hoping for scraps from the kitchen or a penny flicked from the drunken hand of a sailor, flush with his week's pay. Other times, he offered to polish boots or carry luggage, careful not to draw the attention of the constables who prowled the docks, suspicious of every boy with quick hands and darting eyes. There was a night, colder than any Samuel could remember, when he crouched beneath the hull of the coal barge, curled in an old sail for warmth, his breath rising in pale ghosts. Above him, Bram's voice murmured through the planks, telling a tale of a shipwreck off the coast of Dover, of men clinging to splintered beams while the sea roared around them like a furious beast. Samuel listened, his eyelids heavy, and wondered if the river would someday swallow him too, if his bones would join the countless others buried in its muddy bed, lost to the world but never to the current. But there was a stubborn hope inside him too, flickering like the lantern Bram kept near his bunk. Samuel dreamed of saving enough to buy passage on a real ship, one that would carry him far from London's choking smoke and crooked alleys. He imagined himself standing on a deck beneath a sky so wide and blue that it made the city's grime seem like a distant bad dream. Until that day came, he would keep to the river. He would learn its secrets, heed its warnings, and slip through its shadows like a phantom. He would be watchful when the fog rolled in, quick when the constables patrolled, and patient when the hunger gnawed at his belly. For Samuel Finn knew that if he belonged anywhere, it was here, among the drifting souls of the Thames, afloat on hope as fragile as the moonlight on the water's restless back. So the river rocked him to sleep that night, the barges creaking in their slow dance with the tide, the distant toll of a church bell marking the hour when London's rich slept soundly behind locked doors, while the river's children dreamed beneath the stars, holding tight to tomorrow's promises, no matter how easily the current might carry them away. In this 13th drift through the gaslit mist of Victorian London, let us slip away from the hush of the river's edge and wander instead into the winding veins of the city's underbelly, into the narrow passages and secret courts where life, if it could be called such, clung on like ivy to crumbling stone. Here, beneath the roar of carriages and the chatter of the fashionable, there lived a multitude unseen. The mudlarks, the pure-finders, the night soilmen, souls whose very survival depended on what the rest of London cast aside. Among them moved a boy named Jonah Pike, whose feet seemed always bare, even in the frost of February mornings. His hair, a thatch of brown matted with the city's grime, fell into eyes sharp as a magpie's, always scanning, always searching for a scrap, a coin, a thing that might be sold for a crust of bread. Jonah's mother had once scrubbed floors for a kindly doctor's wife in Kensington, but sickness swept her away when Jonah was small enough to still be carried on her hip. Left behind with no father to claim him, Jonah drifted through London's hidden corners until the streets themselves seemed to know his step. By day, he was a mudlark, scouring the banks of the Thames at low tide, picking through the slimy silt for bits of coal, copper nails, scraps of rope, anything the river's restless breath might cough up. He knew where to stand to avoid the worst sinkholes, where the riverbed turned treacherous and sucked at the ankles like a greedy mouth. He knew, too, how to keep watch for the tide's sudden turn, for more than one careless child had vanished beneath that rising gray curtain, never to be seen again save for a whispered rumor of a small hand glimpsed beneath the water. When the tide covered the foreshore once more, Jonah turned to other labors. He might help an older mudlark named Silas, who knew the worth of bones and rags and broken glass, things so lowly that only London's poorest could see their value. Together, they would crawl the alleys behind butchers' shops and taverns, picking through refuse for bones to sell to the rag and bone men, the pure finders who traded dung to the tanneries and dyers. There was money in waste, if you knew where to look, if you were not too proud to bend your back and pinch your nose. Some nights, Jonah found shelter in an abandoned stable behind a row of crumbling houses near Bishopsgate. The roof was half gone, the straw long since turned to dust and vermin nests, but there was a dry corner where he could curl up beside Silas or any other stray who claimed the space that night. They shared warmth when they had none to spare, pressed shoulder to shoulder like pups in a litter, dreaming uneasy dreams as the city's cold crept in beneath the gaps in the planks. Despite the filth, despite the chill and the endless gnaw of hunger in his belly, Jonah felt a strange kinship with his world. There was freedom in it, in the way he answered to no master but the river and the streets. He watched the grand ladies in their carriages pass by, their gloved hands lifted to cover their noses against the stink of the lower wards. And he wondered if they ever envied him in some secret corner of their silk-draped lives. For Jonah had no rules but survival, no curfew but the coming tide, no punishment but the city's silent indifference. One dusk, with the fog creeping low like a ghostly blanket, Jonah crouched beneath the steps of a public house, waiting for the cook to fling out the day's scraps. He was patient as a cat, unmoving even when the cold numbed his fingers. When the kitchen door finally creaked open, a heavy splash of peelings and bones hit the cobblestones. Jonah sprang forward before the rats could claim the choicest bits. He filled his pockets with carrot ends, a crust of stale bread soaked in gravy, a rib bone still slick with grease. Behind him, a voice called soft and low, another boy no older than Jonah, pale and slight, who asked if there was enough to share. Jonah hesitated, his stomach a growl in his ears. But he broke the crust in two and handed it over, watching the boy's eyes widen as though he'd been given a king's feast. They sat side by side on the cold stones, chewing in silence, bound by that fragile fellowship of the hungry. Afterward, the boy told Jonah his name was Arthur, that he had once lived in a proper house with a mother who read him stories by candlelight. Now, he slept beneath market stalls and dreamed of warm beds and warm soup. Jonah listened, but offered no tales of his own. He had no memory of stories by candlelight, only the endless city, the cold river mud between his toes, the smell of rot and smoke in his hair. When they finished, Jonah showed Arthur the stable behind Bishopsgate. They curled up together under a moth-eaten sack, sharing what warmth they could muster. Above them, London carried on. Horses clattered down cobbled streets, laughter rose from tavern windows, gas lamps flickered in the haze. But down in their hidden hollow, two boys slept, dreaming perhaps of the same impossible thing. A world where the tide would turn in their favor, where the streets would offer more than scraps and sorrow. For now, though, there was only the next tide, the next pocket of refuse to sift, the next night to endure. And so Jonah drifted off with Arthur's breath warm against his neck, the city's restless heart beating above them, indifferent and immense, while beneath it the small lives flickered on, fragile and stubborn in the cold hush of Victorian London's shadowed veins. By the hush of the 14th chapter, let us wander away from the damp embrace of the river and the sooty marrow of London's alleys, up toward the ragged fringes of the East End, where streets bore names that clung to older, gentler times, Whitechapel, Spitalfields, yet their lanes were anything but gentle. Here, in the shallow glow of cheap lanterns and the drift of chimney smoke, lived those whose toil never ceased, whose dreams dissolved into the same black fog that crept through every cracked window. It was here, in a cellar beneath a weaver's shop, that an old man named Elias Crow made his home. A man half forgotten by the world above him, a relic of a London that had shed its skin many times, yet always kept the same cold bones. Elias was once a silk weaver of fine renown, his hands deft as a sparrow's wings at the loom. In those days, Spitalfields hummed with the clatter of looms, bright threads twisting into shimmering cloth bound for the parlors of the gentry. But fashion, as it does, drifted elsewhere. New machines came, the big mills of the north rose with their iron teeth, and men like Elias found their craft buried under the thrum of progress. Where once he'd sat at his loom and watched sunlight dance through colored silk, now he squatted in a cellar, mending torn shawls for pennies, scraping out a life from a trade the world no longer honored. His cellar was half below the street, its lone window crusted with grime and cobwebs. Rats made their kingdom there, and Elias, too tired to chase them, treated them like half-welcome guests. They were quiet company, at least, unlike the heavy boots that sometimes thudded on the floor above, belonging to men who came to the weaver's shop not for silk, but for warmth and cheap ale. Each day, Elias rose before the sun, lighting the stub of a candle to thread his needle by its wavering flame. His fingers were crooked now, knuckles swollen with age and damp, but still they worked the cloth with a patience born of half a century at the loom. He mended shawls for the widows of weavers, patched sleeves for laborers who could not afford new coats when the old ones frayed. In his tiny hearth, he boiled thin broth, the scent of boiled onion clinging to the walls long after the last drop was gone. Above him, the city shifted and coughed, its factories belching smoke into a sky that never truly cleared. Sometimes children pressed their faces to his window, peering in at the hunched figure moving in the gloom. To them, Elias was something between a ghost and a curiosity, proof that the old ways still clung on, even as steam and soot tried to bury them. But in the stillness of his cellar, Elias's mind wandered backward more than forward. He remembered the courtship of his late wife, Harriet, who had once danced with him on a May Day morning when the world felt soft and generous. He could still see her hands guiding the shuttle on his first loom, the sun haloing her hair through the open window of their little workshop. When Harriet died, the loom became his last true companion. He could not keep up with the mills, with their roaring gears and endless shifts, but he refused to abandon his craft entirely. So he stayed, mending what scraps came his way, his days measured out in tiny stitches, his nights in memories that warmed him better than the dying coals in his grate. One evening, as Elias sat darning a tear in a lace collar that would fetch him just enough for tomorrow's loaf, a knock echoed from above, 3 sharp raps that startled the cellar's quiet. He pushed himself to his feet, each joint protesting the movement, and climbed the narrow stair to the shop. There stood a girl, hardly more than 16, her bonnet askew and her shawl wrapped tight about her shoulders. She carried a bundle in her arms, a dress of faded green silk, torn along the bodice as though it had snagged on some hidden nail, or perhaps a careless scuffle. Her eyes darted about the room, wary yet hopeful. "Are you Elias Crow?" she asked, voice trembling like the last leaf on an autumn branch. He nodded. She unwrapped the dress and laid it before him. They say you can mend things proper. I have no one else. Elias lifted the dress with careful hands, feeling the fine weave beneath his fingertips, a relic of better cloth, better times. He looked at the girl and saw the edge of fear in her eyes, the worry that if this dress could not be saved, neither could whatever slender hope she carried with it. He did not ask her story. It was not his place. He simply nodded again and told her to return in 2 days' time. She left him with a half-shilling and a whispered thanks that lingered in the air long after the door swung shut. Through that night, Elias stitched. The candle burned low, sputtering in its holder, but he kept at his work. Each pull of the needle felt like a prayer, each knot a promise that some small part of his craft might yet hold meaning in this world that had cast it aside. When dawn came, the cellar glowed with the pale promise of a new day. The dress, though patched, shone softly in the candle's last breath, a small defiance against the darkness pressing at the window. Elias leaned back, fingers numb, eyes heavy, yet within him flickered a warmth deeper than the embers in his hearth. Outside, London's streets filled once more with the scuffle of boots and the hush of whispered deals, the roar of wagons and the clatter of iron. But in one hidden cellar, a weary weaver laid his needle down, and for a moment, beneath the city's endless weight, something gentle and stubborn held its ground, one stitch at a time. Under the dim hush of London's restless sky, we find ourselves in the 15th turn of our lantern's glow, moving now from the old weaver's cellar to the restless breath of Whitechapel's markets, where the air clung thick with the scent of fish guts and bruised fruit, where voices rose like crows above the clatter of handcarts and the mutter of endless bargaining. Here walked countless souls whose names the city would never bother to remember, but who, in their small, stubborn ways, stitched themselves into its very sinews. Among these was a woman named Agnes Trigg, a market hawker, whose cries had once been bright enough to draw laughter from even the surliest butcher's boy. In her younger years, she had balanced baskets of apples on her hip with a grace that made the fruit seem more golden than it was, calling out prices in a voice so sharp and sweet it could slice through morning fog. Now, past 40, and with 3 winters' worth of cough settled deep in her lungs, Agnes's voice rasped like the scrape of a broom on cobbles. Yet still she stood, day upon day, her stall a battered trestle table on Petticoat Lane, draped in bruised pears and speckled eggs, hoping each coin might stretch the next meal just a little further. Agnes had not always been alone behind her stall. Once, her husband, Edward Trigg, had hawked with her. He a big man with a roar that could drown out the fishmongers and charm a shilling from even the most tight-fisted housewife. But Edward had been fond of gin as much as laughter, and the gin had outlasted him in the end, leaving Agnes with a single daughter and debts that nipped at her heels like hungry dogs. Her daughter, Lisa, was 14 now, all elbows and quick eyes, too sharp by half for the world that waited to grind her down. Liza rose before dawn each morning to fetch water from the pump and sort the softest fruit from the firmest, packing what could pass for fresh near the top of the baskets, where a careless buyer might not look too close. It was Liza who chased off boys with sticky fingers and sweet lies, her tongue as sharp as the little knife she kept tucked in her apron. One cold Thursday, the sky pressed low and mean above the market, threatening rain that never quite fell. Agnes leaned against the side of her stall, her shoulders hunched beneath a threadbare shawl, her breath a cloud in the chill. Liza darted between stalls, trading half-rotten apples for a few bruised onions, slipping promises to pay tomorrow when today's coins ran thin. Every so often, she'd glance back at her mother, checking that Agnes had not tipped forward into sleep or worse. For though Agnes's eyes still glimmered with the grit of the East End, her body betrayed her more each month. The cough rattled her chest in fits that left her bent double, palms braced on the table's edge, the rough rasp of breath drawing glances from customers who muttered about contagion and shuffled to the next stall. Still, the 2 women worked. There was no choice in it, no friendly aunt to take them in, no charity to ease the weight of daily hunger. The parish offered the workhouse, but the mere word was enough to make Agnes's back stiffen. Better the market's open chill than the crushing sameness of stone walls and regulated misery. By midday, the market swelled with life despite the threat of drizzle. Coal men shouted prices from wagons, street musicians wheezed out sad tunes on battered fiddles, and the sharper traders hawked tin trinkets and cracked crockery as though they were treasures from distant lands. Liza called out their apples with a lilt that mimicked the way her father once had, her young voice carrying above the din. She caught a few sales that way, an old woman with a basket and careful eyes, a maid who handed over a penny and dashed off before her mistress noticed the stolen moment. Agnes watched her daughter work with a pride that pinched her chest more sharply than the cough. She knew the world could swallow a girl like Liza whole, chew her up in factories, or spit her out into the streets with pockets turned inside out. But Liza was quick, too quick for most traps. Agnes prayed that would be enough. As the sun slipped behind a bank of drifting cloud, a commotion stirred near the far edge of the lane. A ragged boy barreled past with a cry, clutching a small purse to his chest. Behind him, a portly tradesman gave chase, red-faced and spluttering oaths. The boy's feet slapped the cobbles, scattering chickens and upsetting baskets of wilted greens. Before the tradesman could close the gap, Liza stepped squarely into the boy's path. With a deft flick, she stuck out her foot, sending him sprawling into a crate of cabbages. The purse tumbled free, skidding to a stop near Agnes's stall. Liza snatched it up and handed it back to the gasping tradesman, who puffed out thanks between curses. When it was done, the boy scrambled to his feet, eyes wide and wild, and vanished into the maze of stalls before anyone could think to stop him. Liza just shrugged, wiping cabbage leaves from her skirt. The tradesman pressed a tuppence into her palm, a tiny reward for quick thinking, but enough for a heel of bread, a bit of dripping, maybe even a slice of pie if they were lucky. When the market emptied at dusk, mother and daughter packed their baskets, counting what meager coins they had gathered. The day's trade was hardly enough, but it would buy coal for the stove and a bit of supper. Agnes drew Liza close as they turned toward home, their shadows merging in the gaslight's glow. In the hush that fell as the market's cries faded into the night, Agnes felt a fragile comfort in the weight of her daughter's hand, the warmth of that small defiance against the cold city that waited always to press them down. For tonight, at least, they had outlasted it once more. Two voices among many, holding fast beneath the flicker of London's cruel and constant lanterns. In this 16th soft unraveling of London's darkened cloth, our lantern drifts deeper into the hush that settles when stalls are shuttered and footsteps thin along the lanes. Now we leave behind the rumble of Petticoat Lane and slip north, where the city's poorer quarters pressed against the walls of old churchyards, their crooked roofs leaning in like gossiping elders. Here, where shadows grew thickest, a small room above a cobbler's shop held a flickering glow through the night, kept alive by a boy named Peter Hatch. Peter was 15, though his face held an age that hunger and worry had carved deeper than the years alone. He worked under the watch of old Merriweather, a cobbler so stooped and silent that the children in the alley whispered he'd once been a gravedigger who stitched shoes for the dead. Whether true or not, Merriweather took in Peter when he was no taller than the workbench, teaching him the slow craft of mending soles too worn for fresh leather, patching boots for draymen and lamplighters who could not spare the coin for new ones. By day, Peter bent low over his work, his fingers blackened with pitch and glue, the smell of boiled leather and linseed oil clinging to his clothes. He rarely spoke. There was no one to speak to but Merriweather, who spoke even less. In the hush of that dim shop, the only conversation came from the tap of hammer on sole, the sigh of a rasp smoothing down a split heel, the soft crackle of the hearth when the coal was plentiful enough to be lit. Yet it was at night that Peter's small room above the shop took on its secret life. By the glow of a candle stub, he bent not over boots but books. Ragged volumes bought cheap from barrow stalls or borrowed from a kind-faced Methodist who kept a shelf of dog-eared sermons for any curious soul. Some nights, Peter traced the loops of the letters with a finger first, sounding out words in a whisper so as not to wake old Merriweather below. He read of worlds far from Shoreditch and Spitalfields, of ships that sailed beyond the gray rim of the Thames, of men who wrote poems instead of bills of lading, of lands where the sun painted the hills gold and no one went barefoot on frozen cobbles. These pages fed him in a way bread never could, staving off a different kind of hunger that gnawed at the edge of his mind. Sometimes, when the candle burned too low, Peter would pause and press his forehead to the cold glass of his window, staring out across the roofs. He could see the dull glow of London's gas lamps bleeding into the smudge of night, and sometimes a pale wisp of smoke from a neighbor's chimney, a sign that somewhere, someone else still held out against the dark. It was during these nights that Peter let himself dream, just for a while, of what might lie beyond the workbench. Perhaps a day would come when he would mend no more cracked boots, but stand behind a counter of his own, or even teach letters to children who had none. Such thoughts were dangerous, too soft for the cobbled lanes that could break softer things with ease. Yet still, they curled like embers beneath the ashes of his everyday toil. One bitter evening, a knock came at the shop door, just as Peter was banking the hearth's last coal. He opened it to find a girl no older than himself, her cheeks flushed from cold, her gloveless hands red and raw. In her arms, she cradled a pair of boots so ruined that Peter wondered what good could come of patching them at all. "My brothers," she said, her voice hushed, as though the night itself might overhear. "He's got work at the yards tomorrow, but his feet—" She broke off, looking down, shame pooling in her eyes like a winter puddle. Peter took the boots gently from her arms. The soles were split wide as hungry mouths, the leather cracked and leaking the damp inside. He could smell the river on them, the heavy stench of low-tide mud. "Wait here," Peter said, surprising himself with the firmness in his voice. He set to work as the girl hovered by the stove, rubbing her hands together for what little warmth the dying embers offered. He stitched fast but careful, the needle dancing in his sore fingers. Bits of old hide, hoarded scraps from Merryweather's trunk, found new life beneath his hands. He patched and hammered, smoothed seams with beeswax until they would hold, at least for a week more, enough for the boy to stand at his labor without frost biting through to his bones. When he finished, he set the boots in her hands, still warm from his touch. She tried to press a penny on him, but Peter pushed it back. "Keep it," he said. "Buy him bread instead." She stared at him then, stared hard, as if memorizing his face in that flicker of lamplight. Then she slipped away into the street, boots pressed to her chest like a promise. When Peter climbed the narrow ladder to his room that night, the books lay waiting, but he did not open them. He set the candle in its dish and sat instead at the sill, watching the street below empty of all but the drifting mist. He felt the ache in his hands, the burn of the pitch under his nails, and yet a small warmth too, a warmth that lingered long after the coals in the shop hearth sighed into darkness. Above the roofs, London breathed its ragged, ceaseless breath. Below it, a boy with blackened fingers dreamed quietly, fiercely, of pages and boots, of broken souls mended, of small mercies given where the city offered none, and of a tomorrow where his candle might burn a little longer against the hush. In this 17th drifting passage, through the shadows and glimmers of the Victorian London, let us slip now to the edge of Clerkenwell, where the city's ancient bones lay half-buried beneath layers of soot and progress. Here, old courtyards clung to stories older than the gas lamps that now flickered overhead, and narrow lanes twisted like veins behind rows of workshops and ironmongers' yards. It was here, behind a blacksmith's forge that belched smoke into the sky by day, that a woman named Hester Blythe kept her own small corner of quiet rebellion. Hester was not young by the measure of her neighbors. 30, some whispered, or perhaps nearer 40, no one certain but Hester herself, who never offered the truth nor seemed to care who asked. Her face bore the marks of years spent leaning over hot irons and hammering rivets, for she was a tinker by trade, a mender of broken pots, bent kettles, cracked lantern frames. It was work that drew more scorn than praise in these quarters, for tinkering was meant for men with thick arms and louder voices. But Hester had both, if not in breadth of body, then in the quiet force that filled a room when she entered. By day, she walked Clerkenwell's lanes with a battered barrow, the iron scraps she'd mended laid out on oilcloth, gleaming where the sun caught a fresh rivet or a polished hinge. Housewives who scolded their husbands for careless breaks, trusted Hester to patch what they could not afford to replace. She'd squat by a doorstep with a small anvil in her lap, hammering dents from a cooking pot as the neighborhood children gathered round, eyes wide at the sparks that danced from her tools like tiny, fleeting stars. She had learned her craft from her father, a Romany tinker who wandered the countryside with his barrow and his stories. As a child, Hester walked behind him, one hand always brushing the hem of his coat, the other carrying her own small hammer tied to her waist with a loop of twine. In those days, the roads were her schooling. Nights spent beside hedgerows, the scent of wood smoke and rain-soaked grass filling her sleep. When her father died on the road to Cambridge, Hester buried him by an old oak, his barrow parked at the edge of the lane like a vigil. She might have drifted farther on, but London pulled at her in a way the fields could not. She carried her father's hammer and his trade with her into Clerkenwell's narrow veins, carving out a living where few would grant her one freely. By night, her room above the forge was warm with the glow of a single oil lamp and the faint red shimmer of embers drifting up through the cracks in the floor. There she sat cross-legged on the boards, mending not only pots but things more fragile. A child's tin whistle flattened underfoot in a market crush, a bent candlestick that had once lit the pages of a widow's prayer book, a broken tin soldier whose owner waited shyly by her door every Friday, a copper penny clutched tight in his small fist. Hester never married. She said she had no time for men who needed mending more than the iron did. Her voice, when she spoke, carried the evenness of an anvil's ring, no sharpness for its own sake, only truth tempered by labor. The neighbors gave her nicknames behind closed doors, Hester Hammer, the tinker witch. But when their kettles sprang leaks or their pans split at the seam, they came knocking just the same. One winter night, as frost crept along the windows and the forge below fell silent, but for the settling crackle of the coals, a knock stirred the quiet of Hester's room. She opened the door to find a boy of no more than 10, hair stuck flat to his forehead with melted snow, his eyes wide in the half-dark. In his hands he cradled a lantern, its frame bent, the glass cracked so badly it looked ready to fall apart with a sigh. "My ma, she needs it," he stammered before Hester could ask. "She can't see to sew without it. Please, miss." Hester nodded him inside without a word. She cleared a patch on the table, setting her tools in neat rows. Pliers dulled with age, a hammer polished smooth by decades of use, a coil of fine wire salvaged from the scrap piles behind the ironmonger's yard. She worked by the flicker of her lamp, silver sparks falling into her lap as she coaxed the battered lantern back to life, straightening the frame, replacing the warped hinge, sealing the cracks with a narrow band of tin. The boy watched, silent as a church mouse, his breath steaming in the cold room. When at last she lit the lantern's small wick and watched its flame catch steady, the boy's face glowed golden in its light. He slipped a copper into her palm, one coin warm from his pocket. She might have pushed it back, but something in the fierce pride of his stance stopped her. "Mind you, keep it trimmed," she told him as she placed the lantern back in his hands. "A dirty wick's worse than no flame at all." He nodded, eyes wide, then vanished into the night, his small feet pattering down the stairs like a quickening heartbeat. Left alone again, Hester sat back on her heels, feeling the warmth from the repaired lantern still lingering in her fingertips. Outside, London's frost lay thick upon the slates and sills, sealing chimneys in silver lace. But within her room, iron scraps and old tools glimmered under the oil lamp's watchful glow, a small testament that even in a city so quick to break things, there would always be hands stubborn enough to mend them. So she banked her coals for the night, laid her hammer by her side, and listened to the hush that settled deep as the snow, a hush that held beneath its chill the faint promise of sparks waiting to be struck anew. In this 18th turning of our quiet lantern, let us drift farther west, where the city's hunger for wealth pressed its boots onto the backs of the weary. Here lay the bricked canyons of Soho, where foreign tongues tangled with London's gruff brogue, where narrow rooms hummed with the clatter of sewing machines and the sharp hiss of pressed iron on damp cloth. It was in one such garret, up 4 flights of creaking stairs, that a girl named Emilia Rossi bent over her needlework long after the factory bells fell silent. Amelia had crossed the sea as a child, her mother's hand tight in hers as they stepped off a packet boat at the docks, their few possessions bound in linen sacks, smelling faintly of the rosemary and garlic they'd left behind in an Italian village carved into a hillside of olive trees. London was meant to be a promise, but promises in this city often turned to smoke, drifting away in the fog that gathered in every alleyway. Her father, a mason by trade, had found work for a time repairing chimneys and carving stone lintels for new tenements rising in Marylebone. But an accident on a scaffold, an unsteady plank, a slip, a single sharp cry swallowed by the city's roar, left Amelia and her mother with no wages but a sigh of sympathy from the parish clerk. So they turned to the only trade they knew that the city's factories would take, the needle. By day, Amelia worked 12 hours at a small dressmaking workshop, squeezed above a tavern that stank of spilled ale and sweat. She stitched sleeves for gowns she would never wear, her fingers raw from the constant prick of the needle's kiss. The forewoman barked orders in a clipped voice, pushing the girls harder when orders piled up for the shops of Oxford Street and Regent Street, where ladies in feathered hats admired the lace and silks their hidden sisters made in the gloom. When the workshop emptied at dusk, Amelia carried scraps home in a basket, piecework that earned her an extra penny for each collar or cuff she finished by dawn. Her mother, once graceful in her village's market square, now stooped beside her by the single lamp they could afford to keep lit, guiding the hem of a skirt through tired fingers. They spoke little as they worked, the hum of needle and thread their lullaby against the winter's chill that pressed through the garret's thin walls. Sometimes Amelia dreamed she could still smell the fields of her childhood, the sun-warmed earth, the tang of crushed olives. But the only scent that filled her nose here was the sour damp of mold, the coal smoke drifting up from the tavern's hearth below, and the faint sweetness of tea when they could spare a few pence for it. One night, as rain tapped against the soot-smudged window, Amelia paused to stretch her cramped fingers. She glanced at her mother, whose head had tipped forward in sleep, the needle still tucked between stiff, calloused fingers. A half-finished collar drooped in her lap, the tiny stitches neat as lacework. Amelia rose, draping her mother's shawl across her shoulders before returning to the basket. By the dim flicker of the lamp, she threaded her needle once more, her mind drifting far from the dusty garret. She imagined the collar finished, starched and snowy white, fastened at the throat of some banker's wife who would smile at herself in a gilt mirror, never guessing at the girl who stitched it by candlelight with hands trembling from cold. In that thought, Amelia felt neither envy nor bitterness, only a strange hush, as if by finishing this small, perfect seam she stitched herself to the city in a way no factory bell could command. There were moments, too, when her dreams pressed further than gowns and collars. Amelia had once learned her letters from a kind priest in Naples, and she still kept a torn scrap of a prayer book in her trunk. Some nights she whispered the verses to herself as she worked, the Latin words a charm against the draft and the ache in her spine. Sometimes, in the hush before dawn, she would imagine teaching other girls to read. Girls like Rosa, who worked beside her at the dressmaker's shop, eyes flickering with secrets they dared not voice aloud. She picked them gathered in some warm corner of the city, an attic, perhaps, or an unused storeroom, where no forewoman barked orders, no clock marked every minute as profit or loss. A place where the needle could rest a while, where hands could learn to hold a pen instead. But morning always came too soon, and dreams must bow to the rattle of boots on the stair, the slap of rain in the gutter, the forewoman's shrill bark summoning the girls back to their benches. So Amelia worked on, her needle gliding through the linen like a whisper. The lamp guttered low, casting long shadows on the cracked plaster walls. Beside her, her mother breathed slow and steady, her dreams free for a while from the city's grasp. Outside, the rain eased and the first gray light crept through the grime-caked pane. Another collar finished, another cuff neatly hemmed, another hour given to the city's hungry maw. But within the garret, in that hush where dreams stitched themselves to hope, Amelia Rossi bent to her needle and thread and wove something fragile yet unyielding into the fabric of London's endless night. In this 19th hush of our long drift through London's shadowed corridors, the lantern finds its way south again, crossing the smoky belly of the city toward Lambeth, where the Thames spread its damp breath over rows of cramped cottages and the dull clatter of industry. Here, the old parish lanes twisted around brickworks, potteries, and riverside wharves, carrying within their bends the weary hum of 1,000 working hands. It was here that a night watchman named Walter Briggs kept his silent vigil, pacing the same stretch of cobbles while the city's better folk slept behind bolted doors. Walter had not always watched the night. In his younger days, he had worked the kilns of a great pottery yard near Vauxhall, hauling clay by the barrow load, stacking rows of biscuitware for firing, stoking the furnace until the heat painted his face raw. But age and a bad fall on a slick yard floor had robbed him of the strong back that once earned him 6 solid shillings a week. Now he earned fewer coins, trading muscle for wakefulness, tramping the night lanes with a heavy stick and a battered lantern to keep the shadows honest. Each dusk, Walter's wife, Nan, would watch him shrug on his thick wool coat, its elbows patched with rough cloth that bore the faint tang of oil and smoke. She would stand in the doorway of their narrow cottage, clutching the collar of her shawl against the river's creeping damp, and watch him vanish into the swirl of mist and lamplight. Their cottage was small, a single room for sleep, cook, and comfort all at once, but it was theirs, clung to with a stubbornness that no landlord's threats had yet shaken loose. The work was lonely, but loneliness suited Walter in these late years. He had buried 3 children in the span of 5 winters, fevers and coughing fits that drained them pale and small until even the parish doctor could offer nothing but silence. Since then, the hush of the night had become his truest company, a place where no cries or small coffins could find him. He walked his circuit slow and steady, boots striking sparks off the frost-hardened cobbles. His lantern swung from his hand, throwing a thin, trembling light across doorsteps and shuttered shop fronts. He knew every creak of every gate along his route, every loose shutter that clapped in the wind, every broken rail that might trip the unwary. The folk of Lambeth, potters, dockhands, coal porters, slept easier, knowing Walter Briggs kept his watch, though few ever thought to thank him for it when day broke and they passed him by in the lanes. Some nights were quieter than others. The river mist would curl in like a cat, muffling every sound until Walter could hear only the drip of water from an eavespout or the distant toll of a church bell far upriver. Other nights, the city stirred beneath its blanket, drunken laughter spilling from a tavern's back door, the sharp crack of boots where the constable might be needed but rarely came in time. When trouble found its way into his patch, Walter would lean on his heavy stick, his voice low but certain, and most times that was enough to send restless shadows scurrying into the dark. He had his small rituals to pass the slow hours. At midnight, he paused beneath the gas lamp on Canning Street, where the flame always fluttered as if to greet him. There he unwrapped a heel of bread and a curl of cheese Nan had tucked into his coat pocket, savoring each bite as if it were a king's feast. Sometimes, if the wind was still, he would hum a snatch of an old tune, one his mother had sung when he was a boy in Southwark, long before factories and funerals had stolen the sweetness from the song. Toward the river, Walter would stand a moment at the old landing steps, where barges bumped and shifted against the tide. He'd lift his lantern high and watch the black water ripple with borrowed gold, the city's far lights smudged like distant stars. There, he would speak a few words into the night, nothing grand, just a name now and then, Maggie, Thomas, little Ruth. Names no one else spoke anymore, save Nan when she prayed. Walter spoke them like a promise that they were not forgotten, not entirely washed away by the city's endless tide. As the deepest hour drew close, frost rimed his coat and gathered on the stiff brim of his hat. He rubbed warmth into his gloved hands, checked the locks of a back gate behind the potter's yard, nudged a sleeping stray dog away from a doorway so it wouldn't be trodden under by an early coal cart. Sometimes a window might lift, a voice calling soft, "All well tonight, Mr. Briggs?" And Walter would tip his lantern in reply, his voice carrying back through the fog, "All well enough." When dawn threatened the edge of the sky, pink and thin as a new scar, Walter turned his steps homeward. His boots thudded heavy now, the weight of the night pressing into his bones. He would unlatch the door to find Nan waiting in her chair by the cold hearth, her eyes blinking back sleep. She would take his coat, his hat, his lantern, his burdens, one by one, and hang them beside the door. Then, as the waking city began its grind and clamor once more, Walter Briggs would lie down in the hush of their narrow room, closing his eyes to the clatter of carts and the hammer of hooves outside. And in that sleep, just sometimes, the river's murmur would carry him back to nights when no grief yet marked his steps, when all he watched over was the tender breath of children sleeping under a patchwork quilt, warm and safe for one more dawn. Under the smoky hush of a London dusk, where the gaslights quivered like timid fireflies beneath a ceiling of fog, young Eleanor Beale slipped through a narrow alleyway behind the sprawling warehouses of the Thames dockside. Her footsteps pressed into the damp earth, carrying secrets of a life stitched together by caution and small acts of defiance. The world she moved through now was different from the polite drawing rooms she once glimpsed through cracked shutters as a child. This place, where crates and barrels formed shadowy fortresses, was the true beating heart of the city's ceaseless trade, where men labored until their backs curved like old oaks and children darted under wagons for stray scraps of coal. She paused near the rusted iron gate of a yard where sacks of imported tea and crates of rum were stacked like the bones of some giant sleeping beast. Here, Eleanor knew, a man named Barnaby Quinn would be waiting. Barnaby was a name whispered through the back streets. He moved contraband through the veins of London's hunger. But to Eleanor, he was something else entirely. A doorway to an escape she barely dared dream of. Inside the yard, the smell of salt water and damp hemp mingled with the heavy reek of stale ale from the nearby tavern. Lanterns cast thin ribbons of gold across the cobblestones, revealing men in rough coats huddled around a barrel, their eyes flicking up at Eleanor's approach. She tightened her shawl, ignoring the murmur of her own heartbeat in her ears. Barnaby stood apart, leaning against a stack of crates, his figure as lean and sharp as a butcher's knife. When his eyes found Eleanor's, they did not soften, yet they did not harden either. In the brief, flickering silence, Eleanor felt the pull of danger and promise. "Miss Beale," he rasped, flicking ash from the stub of a cigar. "You've come to strike your bargain, then?" She nodded, the chill air scraping her throat dry. "I have, if your word holds." Barnaby laughed, the sound low and humorless. "My word holds for those who hold theirs, girl. You've got the list?" Eleanor reached into her pocket and drew out a small scrap of folded paper. Names of merchants, details of shipments, whispered secrets gathered from overheard conversations at the laundry where she scrubbed linen for the city's wealthier traders. Each word was a small betrayal, but to Eleanor, betrayal was sometimes the only tool left to the poor. Barnaby plucked the paper from her fingers, squinting as he unfolded it under the lantern's glow. He nodded once, approvingly, before tucking it into the lining of his coat. "You've a clever head. Keep feeding me morsels like this, and I'll have you on a ship out of this cursed fog before winter's teeth sink in for good." A tremor of hope stirred inside Eleanor, too fragile yet to be called relief. "And my brother? He comes too." Barnaby's gaze flicked away, restless. "So long as the boy stays quiet and unseen, there's places for little hands on the ships, better than these streets anyway." Behind her, the wind tugged at the hem of her dress, carrying the faraway clatter of hooves on wet cobbles. Somewhere beyond the walls, London's grand carriages ferried men and women to warm parlors, to music and wine. Here, she bartered with criminals for a chance to flee a city that had gnawed at her family's bones since she was old enough to remember her mother's cuff echoing through their attic room. "Tonight, then," she pressed. Barnaby spat into the dirt. "Tomorrow, dusk, meet me by the old mooring post past Shadwell. Bring only what you can carry on your back." She nodded again, pressing her lips together to keep them from trembling. Barnaby turned, already barking orders at the men near the barrel, his voice fading into the coarse symphony of dockside survival. Eleanor lingered a moment longer, her fingers grazing the iron gate as she turned to leave. The weight of her choices pressed upon her shoulders, but there was a new current in her veins too, an unfamiliar taste of agency, in a world that had taught her to bow her head and move unseen. For the first time in her 17 years, she was weaving her own path through London's tangled underbelly. The alley swallowed her footsteps as she retraced her way toward the east end. The fog had thickened, curling around lampposts like ghostly fingers. She passed doorways where old women hunched beneath threadbare blankets, where children sat with bare feet tucked beneath their knees, eyes wide as barn owls, staring into the dark as if it might speak back. Each face was a reminder of what she was leaving and what she might never see again. Her mind drifted to her brother, Thomas. Only 10, but already shaped by hunger and cold. She pictured him as she had left him that morning, curled beneath a heap of old sacks, his breath misting in the drafty corner of the boarding house. She quickened her step. She would not allow London's grip to tighten around his throat as it had hers. As Eleanor slipped through a side street into Whitechapel, a sudden sound made her stop. Hoofbeats again, this time closer, accompanied by the creak of a carriage wheel. She flattened herself against the rough brick of a wall, peering out just enough to see the passing shadow of a black coach. A gloved hand drew back a velvet curtain, revealing a pale face, wealthy, bored, safe. For a heartbeat, Eleanor wondered what secrets lived behind that glass, what gossip and debts, what casual cruelties that trickled down to feed men like Barnaby. When the coach vanished into the gloom, she stepped back onto the street, her feet numb against the frozen cobbles. She thought of tomorrow's dusk, of the river, of the creaking planks of a ship bound for some nameless shore. She thought, too, of what it might mean to be free, not just from the soot and the hunger, but from the endless games of barter and fear that stitched the city together. Above her, gaslights flickered like watchful eyes. Somewhere deep in the city's veins, the clock towers struck the hour, a hollow chime that drifted through the fog, counting down the hours to her final flight. Eleanor wrapped her shawl tighter, and without a backward glance, she let the darkness swallow her, one careful step at a time. The dawn before Eleanor's escape rose not in a burst of hopeful gold, but in a weary wash of gray, as though the city itself wished to keep its secrets hidden beneath a blanket of mist. In the cramped attic room where she and Thomas slept, the walls were thin enough to let the wind whisper through the cracks, carrying with it the distant tolling of St. Mary's bells and the muffled stirrings of the streets below. Eleanor sat beside her brother, brushing a stray curl from his forehead. His eyelids fluttered as he dreamed, perhaps of warmer places, of fresh bread, of a mother's embrace that he had long since forgotten the shape of. She pressed her palm gently to his cheek, feeling the soft rise and fall of his breath. It anchored her in that moment, reminding her that this one fragile life beside her was worth all the risks that lay ahead. Outside, the boarding house stirred awake. Voices drifted up the narrow staircase. Mrs. Pencombe, the landlady, scolding some poor tenant for overdue rent. The rattle of tin mugs as boarders queued for watery porridge. Eleanor's stomach growled at the thought of food, but she pushed it aside. By nightfall, if all went as planned, they would be far from this damp room and its moldy corners, far from the daily ritual of scrubbing the sins of wealthier folk from linens that were never meant for hands like hers. She rose, moving quietly to the battered chest in the corner. Inside were their only possessions: a chipped comb, a woolen scarf that had once belonged to her mother, a small tin of dried tea leaves she had hoarded for months. She folded the scarf carefully and tucked it into a threadbare satchel. The tin of tea, too. Though she doubted she'd find boiling water on the river, the thought of it brought a strange comfort. Last, she pulled out a tiny cloth doll, its stuffing half gone, its button eyes askew. Thomas's tiny guardian. She placed it on his pillow so he might see it when he woke. When Thomas finally stirred, his eyes opened slowly, still glazed with sleep. He squinted at the gray morning light leaking through the grime-streaked window. "Ellie?" he murmured, his voice hoarse. "Is it today?" She knelt beside him, brushing her lips to his brow. "It is, little fox. Tonight we leave. But you mustn't say a word, do you hear? Not to Mrs. Pencombe, not to any of the boys downstairs." Thomas nodded, though a shadow of worry flickered across his pale face. "Will there be food, Ellie? Where we're going?" She forced a smile that felt too big for her face. "There will be more food than you can imagine. Apples, bread, warm soup every day if you wish, and no more cold nights." It was a promise she prayed she would not have to break. They spent the daylight hours in a hush of tense waiting. Eleanor went about her chores as if nothing were different, her hands raw from scrubbing floors while her mind reeled through every step of the plan. When Mrs. Pencombe barked orders, Eleanor obeyed without complaint. She folded linens, stoked the parlor fire, fetched pails of coal from the yard. All the while, she tucked bread crusts into her apron when no one was looking, slipping them to Thomas when he lingered by the stairwell, pretending to chase a mouse. As the afternoon waned, the city outside pressed closer. Voices rose in arguments over debts unpaid. The clatter of carriage wheels mingled with the shouts of hawkers selling rotting apples and cracked eggs. Smoke from countless hearths hung low over the rooftops, blending with the river fog that had begun its slow crawl back inland. Eleanor's eyes drifted off into the window, gauging the slant of the light, measuring how quickly dusk would come. When at last the sun dipped behind the factory chimneys, Eleanor found Thomas curled up on the thin mattress, clutching the cloth doll to his chest. She roused him gently, her whisper cutting through the muffled hum of the boarding house. "It's time, love," she breathed. "Take only your coat. Quiet now." Down the stairwell they crept, boots muffled by years of grime caked onto the steps. In the hallway, the smell of boiled cabbage lingered thick and sour. They slipped past the half-open kitchen door where Mrs. Pencombe sat, counting coins at the table, her lips pursed, spectacles perched at the tip of her nose. Eleanor held Thomas's hand so tightly her knuckles whitened. Through the back door and into the courtyard they fled, past piles of coal sacks and the scrawny cat that watched them with pale, indifferent eyes. The cold bit at their faces, sharp as broken glass. Eleanor's heart pounded so hard she feared the city might hear it, might catch them and drag them back into its maw before they could reach the river's edge. In the labyrinth of East End alleys, they moved like ghosts. Eleanor led them down the narrowest lanes, through butchers' yards and past stables, steering clear of the drunken knots of men who leaned against pub doorways, their laughter slurred and sharp. Once, they paused to hide behind a stack of empty barrels as a patrolman's lantern swung too close for comfort. Eleanor pressed Thomas's head to her side, her breath fogging in the dark. When the footsteps faded, they hurried on. By the time they reached Shadwell, the moon was a dull coin behind the clouds, and the river's song had grown louder, a steady lap of brackish water against the rotting wooden piers. Eleanor could taste the salt in the air, mixed with the stink of fish and the faint tang of coal smoke drifting from the barges. She tightened her grip on Thomas's hand, scanning the shadows for any sign of Barnaby. There, by the old mooring post, a figure hunched beneath a battered tricorn hat, a stub of lantern flickering near his boots. Barnaby Quinn, the ferryman of broken hopes and desperate bargains. Eleanor's throat tightened around a wordless prayer as she stepped into the lantern's meager glow, Thomas clinging to her like a second shadow. The night had arrived. There would be no turning back now. Barnaby's eyes caught the lantern light like a pair of cold coins, glinting beneath the brim of his hat as Eleanor and Thomas emerged from the darkness. Around him, the river's sigh was broken only by the soft creak of wood and the distant clatter of chains from ships moored farther down the bank. His gaze flicked to Thomas, then back to Eleanor, as if weighing the worth of each heartbeat that had led them here. "You're late," he growled, though his voice lacked real anger. He straightened, revealing the battered satchel slung across his shoulder, its seams stretched by whatever half-promises he carried for those desperate enough to trade their past for an uncertain horizon. Eleanor felt Thomas's small fingers tighten around hers. She stepped closer, the wind tugging strands of hair loose from beneath her shawl. "We came as quick as we could," she whispered. "Is it ready? Is there room?" Barnaby's mouth twitched into something not quite a smile. "Aye, there's room, and you've kept your part of the bargain well enough." He gestured down the pier, where a flat-bottomed barge rocked gently against the pilings. Its single lantern swayed in the river breeze, its glow no brighter than a candle's flame swallowed by the fog. The boat was nothing grand, its planks weathered, paint peeling like a scab, the small deck crowded with burlap sacks and crates tied down with frayed rope. But to Eleanor, it looked like freedom itself, plain and unadorned. Beyond its bow, the Thames stretched into the darkness, wide and indifferent, carrying secrets out to sea. "Where does it go?" Thomas's voice was soft, yet it startled Eleanor in the hush. He peered at Barnaby with wide eyes that seemed too large for his thin face. Barnaby squatted so they were nearly eye to eye, his rough fingers drumming on his knee. "First down, River. Little fox. Then you'll be tucked aboard a ship heading to the coast. Maybe farther if the wind favors you. New towns, new folk. Warm food if you're clever enough to earn it." Thomas considered this with grave solemnity, then turned his gaze to Eleanor, searching her face for the truth of it. She bent and brushed her lips against his hair, her breath trembling against his ear. "It's better than here," she murmured. "We'll make it better, I promise." Barnaby rose and motioned them forward. Eleanor lifted Thomas into her arms, feeling the fragile weight of him pressed against her ribs. Step by step, they descended the slick, creaking boards of the pier until the barge's deck greeted them with a low groan beneath their feet. A hunched figure emerged from the shadows at the stern, a boy no older than Eleanor herself, his cap pulled low, his coat patched and damp from the river mist. He nodded once at Barnaby and set about untying the ropes that tethered their vessel to the mooring post. Barnaby tossed his satchel onto the deck, the dull thud swallowed by the slap of water against wood. He turned to Eleanor, his face half lit by the swaying lantern. "Below deck, near the crates. Stay quiet. If anyone asks, you're cargo. Understand?" Eleanor nodded, gathering Thomas closer. She stepped carefully over sacks of flour and coils of rope, lowering herself into the hold, where the shadows swallowed every trace of the city they were leaving behind. The air smelled of salt, old fish, and tar, a crude perfume that, to Eleanor, felt sweeter than any rose water in a rich woman's parlor. Thomas curled into her lap as the boat lurched gently, breaking free from the pier. Above them, Barnaby's voice rumbled low and sharp as he barked orders to the boy at the stern. The lantern's glow bobbed, faded, then disappeared altogether when the hatch was pulled shut, plunging them into a darkness so thick Eleanor could almost feel it pressing against her skin. In that blind hush, she rested her cheek against Thomas's hair, her fingers stroking the worn cloth of his coat. She could hear the Thames now more clearly than ever, the slap of water against the hull, the whisper of the current carrying them farther from the shore with every heartbeat. Each sound was a promise that the city's claws could not follow them here, that the rattling coughs, the hunger pangs, the clatter of coin in another man's pocket would not decide their fate again. Yet even here, hope was a trembling flame. Eleanor's thoughts drifted to the streets they had fled, Whitechapel's muddy lanes, the crooked chimneys, the rows of children with hollow cheeks and eyes that had seen too much darkness for their years. She wondered if she would dream of them tonight, if London's ghost would linger in her mind long after the tide carried her away. Beside her, Thomas shifted, pressing closer. "Ellie," he whispered into the hollow dark, "are we really going far? Far where no one knows us?" She swallowed the knot in her throat and kissed the top of his head. "Yes, little fox, so far that London will forget our names." Above deck, a gull cried, a ragged, lonely sound that echoed across the water like a farewell. The boat dipped and rocked beneath them, the river's embrace both cold and strangely kind. Eleanor closed her eyes and breathed in the smell of salt and pitch and freedom. And somewhere inside her chest, beneath the fear and the weary ache of old wounds, a quiet ember of hope glowed steady and small, warming her against the night. The barge drifted on, carried by the black waters of the Thames, toward a horizon yet unmarked by soot or sorrow, leaving behind a city that devoured its own children and never paused to mourn. And in that drifting cradle of wood and shadows, Eleanor Beale, laundress and conspirator, traitor and sister, leaned her head against the rough planks and let the gentle sway of the river rock her into the soft mercy of sleep.